In Phaedo, written by Plato in 360 BC, Socrates explains his belief that the earth is spherical, in the middle of the heavens, and in perfect equilibrium. The earth is also incredibly vast, with many hollow places in the planet where water, mist, and air have gathered. Inside some of these gigantic subterranean caverns, much of the plant life is said to be bioluminescent, which means it glows, and exceedingly beautiful, with mountains that are smooth and made entirely out of rubies, emeralds, and other exotic stones, including gems more precious than any which we know. Gold, silver, and other revered metals are also to be found everywhere. Their temples are inhabited by the gods themselves, who they speak to directly. All the hollow regions of the earth are said to be connected by great subterranean rivers of water, fire, and mud, which flow between several inhabited regions. One of the massive cavities in the earth is said to be so large and deep that it pierces right through to the other side of the earth. So this cavity, often referred to as Tartarus, is where all the rivers flow together and where they flow forth from again. Most modern scholars believe that this myth is not intended as a literal account of what Plato thought the inner earth was like. But what if, like his antediluvian tale of Atlantis, what if Plato based his dialogue at least partially on truth? Could there really be a sustainable inner sanctuary that we, the public on the surface world, are not aware of? The word bioluminescence comes from bio, meaning life, and lumen, meaning light. Bioluminescent organisms really do exist, and they have the ability to glow almost like magic, just like in the movie Avatar. Many of these organisms use their natural ability to produce light to trick predators. Others glow to attract mates, and some even use light to communicate. This phenomenon is a result of a light-emitting pigment where the light energy is released by a chemical reaction. So it's really amazing and beautiful to observe. The diversity of creatures with this ability is equally astonishing, from algae and aquatic plant life to fireflies and other deep sea dwelling creatures that are rarely seen by humans. Glowworms, that's a common name for a various group of insect larvae, and adult larvae form females that glow through bioluminescence, and many of them may sometimes resemble worms, but they're actually insects. And the glow they produce through, again, a chemical reaction is very efficient, incredibly efficient. Nearly 100% of the energy input is turned into light. And you can compare that to the best light emitting diodes at just 24%. So Australia and New Zealand have some of the most spectacular caves, huge caverns where you can go on guided tours and witness this natural phenomenon up close. Majlis al-Jinn, which is Arabic for meeting or gathering place of the jinn, is located in a remote area of the Selma Plateau in Oman. It is recognized as one of the largest underground caves in the world. There are 3 different entrances to the cave, all of which link to an enormous chamber. The deepest part is 178 meters, which is 584 feet below the top. And to put that into perspective, 12 Boeing 747 jumbo planes would fit inside that cave chamber. There's a local legend that tells of a beautiful woman named Selma who inhabited the cave long ago, and an enormous jinn, which comes down to us as genie in the West, pursued Selma. He was very upset with her. Some of the oldest cultures speak of civilizations inside of vast cavern cities deep within the bowels of the earth. According to many Buddhist and Hindu traditions, there are secret tunnelways that connect to a subterranean paradise, and this is often called Agartha. In India, this underground oasis is best known by its Sanskrit name, Shambhala, which is thought to mean place of tranquility. There are mythologies throughout the entire world, from South America to the Arctic, which describe numerous entrances into these fabled inner kingdoms. Many of the occult organizations, famous esoteric authors, and secret societies concur with these myths and legends of subterranean inhabitants who are basically the remnants of ancient antediluvian civilizations which sought refuge inside of these hollow caverns deep within the earth. My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an author and formally educated anthropologist, and I'd like to invite you to explore some of these inner earth mysteries with me to try to unlock their riddles which have eluded any serious consideration in mainstream academia. Gods with amnesia, subterranean worlds of inner earth. In April of 1819, British officer John Smith was pursuing a tiger through the jungle outside of Mumbai when he stumbled upon a strange cave entrance hidden in the brush. Something seemed oddly deliberate about the cave entrance, so he decided to abandon his hunt to investigate further. He soon discovered what appeared to be ornate carvings in the rock. Little did he know that was just the beginning. Further investigation revealed an entire system of shrines and monuments carved directly into the rock, and 30 different caves. Archaeologists believe that they were constructed around 200 BC as a retreat for Buddhist monks. Each of the caves is unique, with its own intricately designed entrances and interiors. Many of the carvings depict the life of Buddha and his many incarnations. There are also a large number of paintings, many of which are remarkably well preserved. It's amazing how much color and detail still remains after all those years. One of the more popular theories surrounding the caves is that they were built to align with the solstices and other cosmological events. Caves number 19 and 26 do actually align perfectly with the winter and summer solstices, respectively. On their designated days, the sun shines straight through the holes in their roofs, illuminating the religious displays within. Even after centuries, the interiors are still absolutely stunning, The effort and precision required to build these elaborate structures is truly mind-boggling. My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an anthropologist. I'd like to thank you for watching, sharing my videos, and I will see you next time. Nokkalikai Falls is the tallest single drop waterfall in India at around 1,100 feet or 340 meters tall. Legend has it that a local woman named Likai resided in a nearby village and had to remarry after her husband died. She was left with her infant baby and no financial means to support her, so she would be gone much of the day, earning an income to survive. It isn't entirely clear to me why, but what happens next is her new husband kills and cooks her infant while Likai is away, and when she returns home from work, tired and hungry, she finds nobody home except this prepared meal, and she proceeds to eat it. Soon realized what had happened in her absence and went mad with anger and grief and just started running. Eventually, right off the edge of the plateau, this waterfall where she jumped from was named Nokkalikai Falls after her. This waterfall is located near Cherrapunji, one of the wettest places on Earth. India has many waterfalls and many myths, legends, and ancient stories which sometimes sound very plausible and at other times resemble B-quality science fiction movies. For example, Hanuman in Hindu mythology was the name of a hybrid simian commander of a monkey army. His exploits are narrated in the great Hindu Sanskrit poem, the Ramayana, which means Rama's journey, and Hanuman is worshipped as a subsidiary figure in temples dedicated to Rama or directly in shrines dedicated to the ape-like deity himself. In the Hindu epic Ramayana, Nala is the Vanara, or monkey, who is credited as the engineer of the Rama Setu, a bridge across the ocean between India and Lanka, identified with modern-day Sri Lanka, so forces of the god Rama could pass over into Lanka. The wife of Rama in the story was kidnapped by the demon king of Lanka, whose name is Ravana, and Rama, aided by an army of monkeys, reached the end of the land and wanted to cross over the water into Lanka. So Rama starts shooting various weapons at the sea, which then starts drying up, and amongst his monkey army, a monkey hybrid named Nala then led the construction of a bridge across the remaining water of the ocean into Lanka, collecting logs of wood and giant boulders and stones, and having the monkeys cast them into the sea. So they completed the 80-mile, or about 130 kilometer bridge in just 5 days. and Rama and his army passed over it, reached Lanka, where they prepared to fight Ravana. So, Nala, the monkey hybrid, is said to have been born when Vishwakarma, who was a human-like or human-looking deity from a godlike race, embraces Nala's simian mother and has an ejaculation. Incidentally, simian means ape-like or monkey-like. So while some commentaries say that the other monkey slaves merely collected the building material and the hybridized Nala was the one who actually constructed the bridge, other scholars interpret that the monkeys build the bridge themselves, performing the actual labor under his direction and supervision. In either case, Nala is credited as the architect of the bridge and the one with the know-how. From our modern perspective, some of these epics really do involve outrageous scenarios, stories that seem almost silly at times, with artistic depictions that are either cartoon-like and used in children's entertainment, or stone sculptures that can be mistaken for ancient pornographic fantasy rather than a poem that some great minds have considered to have a solid basis in reality. But what evidence is there to convince anyone that these things, even in part, actually happened, even if the story is exaggerated over time? In our modern age of science and empirical evidence, let's focus our attention on searching for some archaeological finds, if there are any, from the time and place of these prehistoric fables. Now, I admittedly have not had a chance to personally examine Adam's Bridge, but I find the geographic location and the descriptive correlation to the ancient texts very interesting. I also find the claims that this site has been debunked, meaning it is simply a natural coral formation, to be premature. Not to mention the dismissive attitude from academia and the media, which became evident when trying to find a single national news report to include in this presentation, but couldn't. As anthropologists, we should not be so arrogant lest we forget what our branch of the sciences had proposed for nearly the entirety of the first half of the 20th century.
The skull of Piltdown Man, once believed to be proof of an evolutionary missing link, has long been proven fake. But the culprit behind the debunked fossil has remained unclear for more than 6 decades, until now. A new report in the journal Royal Society Open Science suggests Charles Dawson, the man who claimed in 1912 to have discovered the Piltdown skull, was responsible. Back in 1953, researchers at Oxford and the British Natural History Museum determined the skull was compiled from human and orangutan bones, stained with chemicals to appear thousands of years old.
It is staggering to think that for close to half a century, the British Museum featured a fake missing link included in all of the textbooks and curriculums, from the United States to every colony of the UK. Of course, this sloppy archaeology was not a one-time event. For example, Nebraska Man, another alleged ancestor, which hit the papers with beautiful illustrations of Nebraska Man in his habitat, all sold to the public based on the discovery of a single tooth, which embarrassingly turned out to be not from a human ancestor, but from a pig. to be fair, there was one major world power of the time that, from the highest levels of its government, did not subscribe to the Piltdown Man or the theory it was based on. And that would be the Nazi regime of the 30s and 40s. Now, this may be new for some, but the Nazi Ahnenerbe was a state-funded anthropology department which Hitler used for political and propaganda purposes at the time, but have nevertheless been continually vindicated, academically speaking, since the end of World War II, at which time all but one member was released, as these were mainly professors that had not committed any war crimes, and except for one that was executed, all the rest went on to teach in their fields of studies at universities all around the world honorably.
An ancient occult legend that tells the story of a continent somewhere in the North Atlantic. There lived a race of super beings who had fallen from grace through evil and vice. The land was called Atlantis. A great flood wiped these beings off the face of the earth. But before they could all be destroyed, certain priests escaped by boat. These escaped priests, believed by mystics to be the original race of Aryan godmen, who were said to be the ancestors of all Indian and European people, descended from the super beings of Atlantis, and that they had lost their powers by mating with mere mortals. The Nordic race did not evolve, but came directly down from heaven to settle on the Atlantic continent. Ancient immigrants from Atlantis had founded a great civilization
in the high Himalayas. Here, survivors of the last cosmic catastrophe took shelter. This is the true cradle of the Aryan race.
There was a sudden infusion on the Y side of Europe, meaning Y chromosome, or the paternal male lineage, of what was famously first recognized as Cro-Magnon types, but the current politically correct term is European early modern humans. So DNA testing on a roughly 30,000-year-old specimen from the Puglisi cave in Italy, compared to modern sequenced genomes, has shown that certain modern European populations, often with Rh-negative blood and recessive traits, are almost identical to Cro-Magnon. The DNA sequence has remained static, that is to say, unchanged, in over 28,000 years, indicating that Europe was first populated during the late Pleistocene by a fully modern individual, not just anatomically correct, which is the term you give to someone between, let's say, 35,000 and 200,000 years ago, but fully modern, which does not happen until 35,000 years ago in an anthropology classroom. In other words, their modern DNA is unchanged since that time. So when did these Europeans do all that supposed evolving? Of course, it is now clear that humanity is in fact a hybrid species with mixed ancestry, including contributions from Neanderthal, a species named Denisovans, and some species which we have not yet found any fossils for, but have detected in the DNA of some modern races, but not in other races. So it has been said that history is written by the winners, and unfortunately this includes what is taught as anthropology. But we're starting to discover that our true history may more closely resemble the ancient mythologies from many of our ancestors than the modern fairy tales from our controlled media, centrally funded schools, and corrupt politicians who publicly hail science and privately hail Satan.
We begin today with what's perhaps one of the most secretive meetings of the world's most powerful people. The Bohemian Grove retreat is held every summer in Monterey, California. Top government and business leaders are among those that attend the men's-only event. It's been going on for decades, but what actually happens there remains a mystery. And that's because the two-week gathering is completely closed to the media. But now an infamous hacker is trying to shed some light on what goes on there. The hacker Sepehr has handed over some emails to RT. Here's one of them. It says, quote, or it shows News Corps executive Andrew Knight allegedly writing to former U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell. And he urges Powell to make sure that the UK Prime Minister Tony Blair comes to the Bohemian Grove. And he says the event should be, quote, a top priority for him.
There's been a lot of speculation about what actually goes on there. Some people say Druid worship goes on there because there's a lot of worshiping of the redwood trees. There's a giant ceremony with like a 40-foot owl. Right. There have been photographers who've gotten inside, and it just seems like very bizarre rituals happening by people who have enormous influence in the world. And so the idea that they gather to do this every year is sort of a little bit unsettling for people.
Speaking of these people that do have enormous influence, who do we know about who's on the guest list?
Nixon went, Reagan went, Hoover went. Bill Clinton has famously made fun of it, is saying that it was naked Republicans rubbing themselves against redwood trees. But Nixon definitely, on the Watergate tapes, he actually is heard sort of making fun of it and saying that it's a gay event. But we also know that major CEOs, basically anyone who's influential in America and around the world, has come to this event or been invited.
So yeah, it seems like all the world's most rich and powerful, the policymakers, the influence makers are there. Yet you don't really hear too much about it.
My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an author and anthropologist and would like to invite you to join me in awakening from a long amnesia. Species with amnesia, our forgotten history. Gods with amnesia, subterranean worlds of inner earth. The occult secrets of Vril. And 1666, redemption through sin. I would like to thank my subscribers who share my posts as I rely on word of mouth, and I appreciate all of the positive feedback, reviews on my books, and I thank you very much for listening. Egypt is a mysterious land filled with a rich history and many priceless treasures. In 1996, in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, an Italian mineralogist spotted an unusual yellow-green gem in the middle of one of Tutankhamun's necklaces. The jewel was tested and found to be glass, but intriguingly, it turned out to be much older than the earliest Egyptian civilization. Geologists traced its origins to unexplained chunks of glass found scattered in the sand in a remote region of the Sahara Desert. But the glass itself is a scientific enigma. How did it get to be there, and who or what made it? An Austrian chemist had established that the glass had been formed at a temperature so hot that he postulated it could only have been caused by a meteorite impacting with the Earth. And yet, there were no signs of a suitable impact crater, even in satellite images. The first atomic bomb detonated by the United States in New Mexico at the Trinity test site in 1945 created so much heat that it formed a crater of radioactive glass in the desert about 10 feet deep and over 1,000 feet in width. Where the glass formed from meteor impacts are filled with particles of the meteor embedded into it, the glass from these atomic detonation sites resembles what we see in King Tut's necklace. When Robert Oppenheimer, the architect of the modern atomic bomb, famously said, "I am become the destroyer of worlds," he was quoting from ancient Vedic texts, and he seemed to believe that the deserts on a number of continents today are likely the result of prehistoric nuclear warfare.
I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Oppenheimer was once asked by a student of his, immediately following the Manhattan explosion, and I quote, "How do you feel after having exploded the first atomic bomb on Earth?" And Oppenheimer's reply to the question was, and I quote, "Not first atomic bomb, but first atomic bomb in modern times." Oppenheimer was implying that it was atomic warfare that was described in ancient writings of the Mahabharata epic, and seemed totally convinced that these descriptions accurately matched the effects of modern nuclear weapons. Is man on the threshold of a new world, or merely stuck on a circular treadmill, repeating the doomed lessons from history which we never seem to learn? Ireland's long history is riddled with folklore, ancient mythology, and ancient societies, which include the Druids, who were highly regarded among the Celts. They were considered teachers, wise priests, and even as magicians. Many stories and myths indicate that the Druids frequented oak forests a lot. Subsequently, the Celtic meaning of the word druid is knowing or finding the oak tree. Stories of fairies playing pranks on farmers and leprechauns hiding their gold at the end of a rainbow are other examples of legends preserved in Celtic society. The Celts believed the year was divided into two parts, the lighter half in the summer and the darker half in the winter. Samhain, or Halloween, was the division between these halves. The Celts believed that the veil between our world and the other world was thinnest at this time. The day after October 31st, which is Halloween, is the Day of the Dead on November 1st, or All Saints' Day, when those who have passed away are remembered, and some Celts would wear costumes to confuse the spirits potentially roaming our world during the time of transition. They did not leave behind a written record, so knowledge of the Druids comes from classical writers of their time, such as the Greeks and Romans, and they were compared to the Aryan Brahmins of India, the Pythagoreans of Greece, and the Chaldean astronomers of Babylon. Julius Caesar wrote that they, and I quote, know much about the stars and celestial motions, and about the size of the earth and universe, and about the essential nature of things, and about the powers and authority of the immortal gods, and these things they teach to their pupils, end quote. That said, there is surprisingly very little that is known about the ancient origins of the Druids, at least as far as academia is concerned. Turning to legend, let us start with one concerning how Scotland got its name. Scotta, in Irish mythology, is the name given, in this version of the tale, to the daughter of an Egyptian pharaoh around the time of the Exodus, who married someone named Goidel Glass and became the founder of the Scots and Gaels after being exiled from Egypt. Now, Goidel Glass was the grandson of a Scythian prince, one of 72 chieftains who allegedly built the Tower of Babel. Are you still with me? Good. Goidel Glass is credited with the creation of Gaelic which is the Proto-Irish language, and it's from one of the original 72 languages that allegedly arose from the time of the confusion of tongues, the part in the Bible where God gets upset and destroys the tower and disperses the people, confusing their languages. I admit these are fantastic stories, but they seem to have been taken quite seriously by European royalty. The size of this stone is about 26 inches by 17 inches by 11 inches, and its weight is approximately 336 pounds. The top bears chisel marks, and there are rings at each end for easier transport. In appearance, insignificant, but to kings and queens, an irreplaceable artifact. It is called the Stone of Destiny, and it has been revered for centuries as a holy relic and fought over by the Scottish and English for some 700 years. The stone has been used successively by British and other monarchs as a very important part of their enthronement ceremonies. Legend has it that it was transported to Ireland via Spain by Princess Scotta, the eldest daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, also known as Princess Meritaten, who fled Egypt following the overthrow of her father. For those interested to go deeper down this rabbit hole, you can check out a book written in 1939 by none other than Sigmund Freud called Moses and Monotheism. The grave of Princess Scotta allegedly lies in an Irish valley known as Glen Scoithin, or Vale of the Little Flower, indicated by a road signpost, and the trail from the road leads along a stream to a clearing where a circle of large stones marks the gravesite. As for Egyptian graves, there are a striking number of red-headed royal mummies belonging to the Hyksos pharaohs, a word which meant foreign rulers to the ancient Egyptians. There is no doubt that the Hyksos were foreign to the African continent, as they introduced the horse and chariot to Egypt, and there are no horses at all in the sub-Saharan African fossil record. They also introduced some advanced metal, and there are now interesting discoveries being made regarding genetics.
Well, there's our research that we're hearing today that shows half of all Western European men are somehow related to the Egyptian pharaoh King Tutankhamun.
Not only do half of Western European men have this connection, genetic profile connection, but 70% of men in Britain, which is astounding, but they all have the same genetic profile or same ancestry as King Tut from Egypt way back when. And here's what's really shocking about this. Less than 1% of modern day Egyptians have that same connection. So it kind of makes you wonder, well, if he's Egyptian, but the ancestry isn't Egyptian, how did it evolve? Which way did it move? And it looks like it didn't start in Egypt, but it evolved and went to Egypt and may have started in Europe. And that's why all the Europeans have this background.
Isn't that interesting?
Red hair is the rarest natural hair color in humans, was thought to be the sign of a witch during the Middle Ages, and the distribution of red hair in the world population is about 1%. But in Scotland and Ireland, it's about 10 to 13% of the population that has red hair, with 30 to 45% unknowingly carriers of the red hair gene. This region is also particularly high in rhesus negative blood type, sharing this trait with the Basque, Berbers, and others in an interesting and important topic, which I will continue on in a future presentation. My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an author and anthropologist and would like to invite you to join me in awakening from a long amnesia. Species with amnesia, our forgotten history. Gods with amnesia, subterranean worlds of inner earth. The occult secrets of Vril. And 1666, redemption through sin. Archaeologists have discovered Los Pinchudos, a forgotten city deep within the Amazon rainforest of the long-lost tribe of white-skinned, blonde-haired people that the Inca referred to as the Cloud People, or Cloud Warriors. Los Pinchudos is an elaborate tomb complex perched into the high rock cleft in one of Peru's northern Andean cloud forests. It's a natural and cultural World Heritage Site and features clay and stone tombs with wooden roofs. The 6 unusual statues with large phalluses are what gave the site its name. Los Pinchudos translates to the big penises. So little is known about these people that carved these settlements out of the dense foliage, but as I said, the Inca civilization called them the Cloud People, or Chacapoya, which is named after the cloud forest that they inhabited in what is now northern Peru. So although they left no written language, they did leave scores of stone ruins and mummies, and for many centuries the Cloud People cut farm terraces and villages into these steep slopes and raised llamas and guinea pigs until around 1470, when they were finally overwhelmed by the Inca, who conquered the region. And when the Spaniards arrived in 1535, the surviving Cloud People joined them to subdue the Inca. The Europeans were very impressed with their courage, skill, battle prowess, but by the 1700s, smallpox essentially drove them to extinction. The Chacapoya did leave mummies, as I said, and archaeologists have discovered an underground burial vault inside a cave. The Spanish conquistador and chronicler of Peru, Pedro Ciza de Leon, wrote of the tribe, and I quote, "They are the whitest and most handsome of all the people that I have seen, and their wives were so beautiful that because of their gentleness, many of them deserve to be the Inca's wives and to also be taken to the Sun Temple." The oldest mummies in the world are the Chinchorro mummies from northern Chile and southern Peru, while the earliest Egyptian mummified remains date to around 3000 BC. The earliest Chinchorro mummified remains date to 5000 BC. The Chinchorro culture was the only Andean culture that performed mummification on all members of their society. In all other Andean cultures, only the elite were mummified. So the Chinchorro mummies have Caucasoid hair and features, and only the Chinchorro culture consisted exclusively of Caucasoids, and that all other Andean cultures were comprised of a Caucasoid elite ruling over another racial group. A major burial site of the Nazca culture was the Chuchilla Cemetery, established in 200 AD, used for about 600 or 700 years, and the hair of the mummies are obviously Caucasoid here, and they were all wearing long robes. The ceramic vessels that you see were produced by the Mochi culture. That's from around 1 to 800 AD, and they all have beards. Facial features are Caucasoid, and again, they're all wearing long robes. The Wari civilization was a pre-Inca population who inhabited the area now known as Lima in Peru. They left blue-eyed, decorated mummies.
It's believed she sat this way for more than 1,000 years, propped up against an earthen wall, a pair of orbs in her eye socket setting a blank blue stare since about 700 AD. Wrapping her in tissue paper, Peruvian archaeologists hoisted the mummy to the surface in the Huaca Pucllana excavation site as cars whizzed by in the country's capital city, Lima. Archaeologists say the ancient scene dates back to the Wari culture that flourished in Peru even before the Incas came to power.
2,000 years ago, a mysterious and little-known civilization with a blue-eyed elite ruled the northern coast of Peru, and these people were called the Mochi. They built huge pyramids that still dominate the surrounding countryside. Some were well over 100 feet tall. The Lord of Sipan tomb is held by some archaeologists to be one of the most important archaeological discoveries in this region of the world in the last 30 years, as the main tomb was found intact and untouched by thieves. The Spanish explorer Pizarro asked the Inca who these light-skinned blondes and redheads were, and the Inca Indians replied that they were the last descendants of the Viracochas. The Viracochas, they said, were a divine race of white-skinned men with beards, and they were so like the Spanish that the Europeans were called Viracochas the moment they came to the Inca Empire. And the Inca thought that they were the Viracochas who had come sailing back across the Pacific. So all over the world we find legends such as the Viracochas. They all share similar themes of being visited in the distant past by a race which seems to have been deified. According to the principal Inca legend, before the reign of the first Inca, the sun god, Kontiki Viracocha, had taken leave of his kingdom in present-day Peru and sailed off into the Pacific with all of his subjects. So it's interesting to note that in Africa there's a gentleman by the name of Credo Mutwa. He's a 94-year-old shaman living in South Africa, and he claims that tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed people have been seen by black African tribes throughout the continent long before the white Europeans arrived. So Credo is a very respected historian of the Zulu nation, and he said when the Europeans first came, the black Africans thought that it was the return of these same white gods, which they had called the Mzungu. And as a result, they called the European settlers by the same name, which is still used today. This is very much the same reaction as the Central American people had when Cortez and his Spanish invasion party arrived in 1519, and they thought that this was the returning Quetzalcoatl. Patagonia is a region in southern Argentina and Chile extending from the Andes to the Atlantic. There are many accounts of a legendary race of extremely tall people that were first mentioned by Ferdinand Magellan and his crew, who claimed to have seen them while exploring the coastline of South America in the 1520s. Antonio Pigafetta, a crew member and chronicler of Magellan's expedition, wrote about their encounter, and I quote, "One day we suddenly saw a naked man of giant stature on the shore of the port, dancing, singing, and throwing dust on his head. The captain, Magellan, sent one of our men to the giant so that he might perform the same actions as a sign of peace. Having done that, the man led the giant to where the captain was waiting. When the giant was in the captain and our presence, he marveled greatly and made signs with one finger raised upward, believing that we had come from the sky. He was so tall that we had reached only to his waist, and he was well proportioned. The captain named the people of this sort Patagoni." Many other accounts of giants in South America followed, and common sort of men, both in stature, strength of body, and also in the hideousness of their voice. In the 1590s, William Adams, an Englishman aboard a Dutch ship rounding Tierra del Fuego, reported a hostile encounter between his ship's crew and abnormally tall and powerful natives. in 1766, Captain John Byron had circumnavigated the world in his. When we came within a little distance from the shore, we saw, as near as I can guess, about 500 people, some on foot, but the greater part on horseback. One of them, who afterwards appeared to be the chief, came towards me. He was of a gigantic stature, and these people may indeed more properly be called giants than tall men. If this mythical race was real, what happened to them? Where did they go? Were the Patagonian giants troglodytes? The marble caves of Patagonia, Chile, also called the Marble Cathedral, are considered by some to be the most beautiful cave network in the world. Formed by 6,000 plus years of waves washing up against calcium carbonate, the smooth, swirling blues of the cavern walls are a reflection of the lake's waters, which change in intensity and hue depending on the water levels and the time of the year. Some of the oldest cultures speak of civilizations inside of vast cavern cities within the bowels of the earth. Mythologies throughout the world, from South America to the Arctic, describe numerous entrances to these fabled inner kingdoms. Many occult organizations, esoteric authors, secret societies, they all concur with these myths and legends of subterranean inhabitants that are the remnants of antediluvian civilizations which sought refuge inside of these hollow caverns inside of the earth. Assuming that the myths are true and the earth is at least partially hollow, how could life survive underground? How would organisms receive the ventilation required to breathe miles below the surface? What would provide the light needed to see? Are there any known sources of sustenance available that could provide for a large human population? Slovakia is a Central European country known for its breathtaking natural landscape, rich history, and numerous castles. Near the Austrian border, the capital city, Bratislava, is probably best known for its pedestrian-only Old Town, which only allows vehicles in at certain times to make deliveries. There are many bicycles, however, and it has a very pleasant medieval feel to the inner city, with narrow, winding streets, a hilltop castle next to the river Danube, and many historical churches to visit, featuring just amazing architecture. On warm days, almost every cafe has an outdoor seating section in the street where Slovakia's most famous national treasures can be observed, appreciated, and admired. Its enchantingly beautiful women, which leads us to our history lesson. Born in 1560 into a famous family of Hungarian nobility, This story is about a girl raised with the utmost privilege, descended from what is considered by some to be royal bloodlines that stretch far back into antiquity. An ancient family that has a notorious history of dark practices, including many incidents which took place in this Slovakian castle, now left mostly in ruins. Her childhood nurse was named Ilona and was said to have been a practitioner of black magic. And the word black in this context means hidden or secret, probably because it involved the sacrifice of children, primarily it would seem for their blood. Her favorite aunt was reported to have practiced witchcraft, and she was married to a count at the age of around 14 or 15, but he was never around, so this aunt became very influential in her life, as was her uncle, a Luciferian alchemist, and her brother, who was probably best known for pedophilia. So history remembers her as the Countess Elizabeth Bathory, a sadistic example of someone who participated in blood rituals and whose behavior, some claim, was the result of an unusually deranged upbringing, but may in fact be not that unusual and actually based on cruel practices which originated in a far distant and even prehistoric time. She was eventually sentenced to solitary confinement in a tower of her castle, where she died in 1614, but not before authorities, on the orders from the king himself, collected testimony from more than 300 witnesses, including priests, noblemen, along with other personnel that resided with her in the castle, tabulating the number of victims to somewhere around 650 pubescent girls between the years of 1585 to 1610. The young girls were reportedly brutally tortured, as the blood of virgins was a key alchemical component of her beauty regimen. So that number of 650 victims appears in a journal by Bathory herself, citing her fondness for drinking and bathing in the fresh blood, earning her the nickname Countess Dracula. The legend of the vampire is also synonymous with another European royal, Vlad the Impaler of Transylvania, the 15th century ruler who first terrified, then drank his victims' blood, and although some sources state that rather than drink the blood, he would merely eat bread dipped in his victims' blood. But in any event, Transylvania turns out to have ancestral links to none other than Prince Charles of Wales, a little known fact that is now emerging after being publicized in a brochure by the Romanian National Tourist Office, after allegations started coming to light about the private occult rituals of the royal family, which for the most part, if it's to be believed, resembles the sex magic, sacrifice, and blood consumption that did not die out with the ancient cults, but seems to have survived covertly and just gone underground. Irish novelist Bram Stoker based his famous book Dracula, which means son of the devil in Romanian, and thousands of tourists visit the town of Castle Bran in Transylvania each year for the first-hand look at where Vlad III lived. Now, biblically speaking, Baal worship is mentioned in the Old Testament as being practiced by the inhabitants of Canaan, and that later became known as Palestine, which is named after the ancient Phoenicians. Syria Palestina was a Roman province between 135 in about 390 AD, and it was established by the merger of Roman Syria and Roman Judea, and later reduced to just Judea. But Baal is described as a fertility god in most museums, universities, and books, and this description or title is justified by the well-documented infant sacrifices that were known to take place to a large metal bull deity, which was made scalding hot with a lit furnace inside of it, which unfortunately ensured that the child suffered an excruciating death. And while it's correct that Baal was depicted as a bullman, I would argue that this particular sect could be linked to another people who deified a mythological bullman, and they were separated by a short distance geographically, but distanced by many centuries, going back to the Minotaur of the Minoan civilization of Crete, which met its demise around 3,600 years ago with the terrible eruption of the Santorini volcano. The Minoan civilization was an advanced seafaring empire that flourished in the Mediterranean around 4 millennia ago, and by flourished I mean totally dominated as a colonial power, and we can safely presume this for several reasons. One of which is the fact that their very aesthetically exquisite island capital of Crete, which was strategically situated among some other great empires around them, had absolutely no walls anywhere surrounding it. Absolutely no fortification whatsoever. And many parts of this very artistically amazing city was preserved, perfectly preserved, thanks to the volcanic dust that covered everything. And what we see is a people who were not worried at all about being attacked or invaded, and instead seemed to be people who were themselves very much feared. Much of their writing, which is called Linear A, that they left behind is still a mystery, as it has not been deciphered yet. So a lot of what we know comes from classical writers of other civilizations, and a lot of them claim that this bull god required regular human sacrifice. The term Minoan refers to King Minos, who was associated in Greek mythology with the famous labyrinth and the Minotaur. And this is usually identified with the site at Knossos, the largest Minoan site on Crete, which according to Homer once had up to 90 cities on it. So this Minotaur was described by the Roman poet Ovid as being part man and part bull. King Minos was said to have constructed the labyrinth to house the Minotaur, a hybrid creature born out of the union between the king's wife and a bull. And while there's debate regarding several archaeological sites which exist on the island, each having proponents with controversial claims for why it is their site described in the ancient texts, there's no longer any debate as to the fact that sacrifices were made, and this is corroborated again recently by a skull found in the soil beneath the modern city of Chania, Crete, the ancient city of Cydonia, and the cranium belonged to a young girl dating from around 1280 BC, which was found in pieces alongside skulls from some animals. And during the excavation published in 2010, that touted evidence of a ritual which included the sacrifice of animals and a young female girl. And this is according to Maria Vazaki, the site's chief excavator and director of antiquities and cultural heritage for the Greek Ministry of Culture. While Minoan Linear A is still not deciphered, Linear B is, and stone tablets bearing references to Zeus and Dionysus were found, confirming the cult of Dionysus in the Minoan civilization. The Dionysian mysteries were a ritual of ancient Greece and Rome which used intoxicants and other trance-inducing techniques, such as dance and music, the goal being to liberate the higher self, or true self, or that part of an individual which is theoretically somehow connected to everyone and everything else by hypnotizing or distracting the ego. It might be a stretch for some, but in some ways this philosophy can be seen in some of the ritualistic prayer chants and dance of the Sufis, an esoteric branch of Islam, but not totally accepted by many Muslims, in which they call it the destruction of the self. And by self, I mean the ego self, or association with your own self-centered reality, and the goal is to subjectively experience a communion with God. Now, the Minoan bull cult existed at a time during the Great Year, a term coined by Plato, which references a roughly 25,000 year cycle. And this is known to most as the precession of the equinox, the path the sun takes through the 12 houses of the zodiac, rising in a different constellation roughly every 2150 years. And when it has completed one cycle, we call that a great year. So the era of Christianity, when it started, is often symbolized with the fish, and this can be seen in the astrological sign of Pisces. So the 2150 year era, which started around the time of the birth of Christ, we are currently transitioning out of, astrologically speaking, and into the age of Aquarius. Now, before the Christian era, that is to say the 2000 year, roughly 2000 year period before Christ, is known in occult circles today as the Aryan Age, which is almost universally symbolized by the ram. Now, before that, 2000 BC, or 4,000 years ago, around there, during the Minoan civilization, it was the age of Taurus. Taurus precedes Aries, and so the Minoans and their bull god reflect this symbolically. So in this context, the deity is not so much a bull god as it is a sun god, a solar deity. Not just a fertility deity, but symbolic of a solar cult when the sun is in the house of the bull. So let us turn to the spectacular Minoan art and ponder why these people, some of whom smeared red ochre mixed with animal fat on their skin, as the men in ancient Egypt did, but that's another story. Let's focus for now on the bulls and how they portray themselves artistically, leaping over them in an arena. Does this activity remind you of anything? DNA sequencing has shown the genetic link between the Minoans and Europeans, or Caucasians if you prefer that term. But now we're talking about mythology. And is there any other ritualistic link that you can think of to the bull? How about bullfighting, which is still practiced in many parts of Europe today? Have you ever wondered why they must kill the poor bull at the end? What started this cruel tradition? Well, maybe there's a clue in the fact that the bulls are colorblind. So the toreador that is waving around a red cape selects red not to get the attention of the bull better, but the red cape is symbolic. Just like the killing of the bull is symbolic of the death of the age of Taurus and the start of the next age. Another ancient religion from around this time period is the worship of Mithra, which many people attribute to the Romans, but it predates the Roman Empire by millennia. And we see pre-Christian Mithras in the center of a zodiac here with the same cardinal signs as other famous figures have been symbolically portrayed. And in this era, in this age, we see Mithras doing what? That's right, it's clearly killing the bull, symbolically ending the Taurian age. And this same act is represented in the Bible, in the Old Testament, called old because it predates Jesus and the events of the last 2,000 years. So it's old, and in this case, Moses, we're talking 3,500 years ago, punished his people when he came down from the mountain for what? That's right, worshiping a bull. So again, symbolically, punishing them or destroying the golden calf. This scene, in my estimation, is another reflection of the solar mysteries, which some of you have oversimplified by calling paganism, but hopefully are starting to see that it's part of a much bigger and older picture than most have suspected, and definitely stretches past the Holocene into the Pleistocene. My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an author and anthropologist, and would like to invite you to join me in awakening from a long amnesia. Species with amnesia, our forgotten history. Gods with amnesia, subterranean worlds of inner earth. The occult secrets of Vril. And 1666, redemption through sin. Ziggurats were a form of temple common to the Sumerians, Assyrians, and Babylonians of ancient Mesopotamia. They were constructed using principles of sacred geometry, just like all ancient pyramid-like structures around the world, except that these were constructed entirely of mud and clay rather than stone. Sun-baked bricks made up the core of the ziggurat, with fired bricks facing the outside, which were also very beautifully glazed in different colors and designed with symbols of astrological and astrotheological significance. The earliest ziggurats began near the end of the early dynastic period, around 4,500 years ago, so it is quite amazing and impressive that they held up so well and are still here for us to marvel at. Ziggurat size varied, but often they had 7 tiers, between let's say 2 and 7 tiers, and they supported a shrine at the top, according to Herodotus, and this sacred shrine was the scene of a sacred marriage, an elaborate sex ritual which was revered with the highest importance and held a significance that cannot be overstated for the ancient Sumerian ideas about the interaction of humans, gods, and goddesses. The Mesopotamian ziggurats were not places for the public to come and enter for worship, but instead were believed to be dwelling places for the gods themselves. And each city had its own patron god or goddess, and only priests were permitted inside, as it was their responsibility to care for the gods and to attend to their needs. The astrologer priests were very powerful members of Sumerian society, and this was not an egalitarian society at all. The social order of the nobility was based largely on ancient bloodlines. The sacred marriage began with a journey and procession by the king to Inanna's temple, or it would have been called Ishtar's temple in the case of Babylon, which came after Sumer, and there would be preparation of the bride, which was actually a sacred prostitute, and she would be washed, anointed with oils and fragrances, and adorned with beautiful garments. The procession was accompanied by the singing of love songs and other festivities, and a great banquet, but the core of the ritual was an act of sexual congress between the king and the goddess figure, and this sexual union was intended to promote the fertility of the land, and it was the type of sex magic ritual that modern secret societies still practice. and occult authors such as the late Aleister Crowley were directly inspired by. So just to be clear, the sacred marriage was not taboo at all, but a state-sponsored occasion, a required royal ritual in which the king played the male role of the deity Dumuzi, the spouse of Inanna, who could be compared to Venus, Aphrodite, Ishtar, and many other goddess archetypes, the name depending mostly on the time period and geography. The Ishtar Gate was the 8th gate to the inner city of Babylon, excavated in the early 20th century, with the original kept in Berlin. This dedicatory inscription on the Ishtar Gate by Nebuchadnezzar is engraved in cuneiform dating back to 575 BC, and this excerpt translates as follows, and I quote, "Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the faithful prince, appointed by the will of Marduk, the highest of princely princes, beloved of Nabu. Following the filling of the street from Babylon, both gate entrances became increasingly lower. Therefore I removed them, laid their foundations with asphalt, and had them made with blue bricks on which wonderful bulls and dragons were depicted. I covered the roofs by laying majestic cedar lengthwise over them. I hung doors of cedar adorned with bronze at all the gate openings, with bulls and dragons in the gateways, and thus adorned them with luxurious splendor, so that people might gaze upon them in wonder. I let the temple be built like a mountain of fired bricks in the Babylonian precinct." Incidentally, this is now in the Pergamon Museum and is really worth checking out in person if you ever get a chance to visit Germany. While it is not true that agricultural civilization started only in Mesopotamia during the Holocene, it is true that animal domestication did flourish there, and ox were like tractors of the ancient times. So their civilization really boomed, and horses with chariots were like battle tanks to the relatively technologically primitive people in Europe and the Indian subcontinent by comparison, who lost whatever civilization they had attained at the end of the Pleistocene, or the close of the Ice Age, a period of great global cataclysms recorded in myths and legends around the world, from the sinking of Atlantis to the biblical flood to the Epic of Gilgamesh. Evidence of this Babylonian diffusion can be seen linguistically in the many Indo-European or Aryan languages that spread across the old world, but it can also be found in more subtle places, such as our modern banking system, which is run by an elite pseudo-religious cult that can trace their roots back to the mud brick ziggurats between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now modern-day Iraq. My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an author and anthropologist, and would like to invite you to join me in awakening from a long amnesia. Species with Amnesia, Our Forgotten History. Gods with Amnesia, Subterranean Worlds of Inner Earth. The Occult Secrets of Vril. And 1666, Redemption Through Sin. Enoch is a very important and revered figure in biblical literature. His name appears in the book of Genesis, where he is described as the 7th generation from Adam, and he is the famous great-grandfather of Noah. So his story took place before Noah's flood, or the Great Deluge, or as geologists and anthropologists say, the event at the end of the Pleistocene Age and the start of the current Holocene Age. This is also around the time when Plato suggests that Atlantis was submerged by the rapidly rising sea levels from melted glaciers of the antediluvian or Ice Age. So according to Genesis, Enoch, and I quote, walked with God and was seen no more because God took him. This walking with God was understood to refer to special revelations that were made to the patriarch, which was familiar to the authors of the New Testament and also utilized by the community that originally collected the Dead Sea Scrolls. According to Genesis, the Nephilim were offspring of the union between the sons of God and the daughters of men before the deluge, and they later inhabited Canaan at the time of the Israelite conquest. So the book of Enoch connects the origin of these Nephilim with fallen angels, and in particular with those that were referred to as the Watchers. Semyaza, an angel of high rank, is described as leading a rebel sect of angels in a descent to earth to have sexual intercourse with human females. In addition to Enoch, the book of Jubilees also states that ridding the earth of these Nephilim was one of the reasons the earth was flooded in the first place in Noah's time. And these works describe the Nephilim as basically being evil giants. That's one interpretation of the word. I would now like to read a small passage from the book of Enoch, chapter 1, the Watchers, and I quote, "And it came to pass when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. And Semyaza, who was their leader, said unto them, and I quote, I fear ye will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. And they all answered him and said, and I quote, Let us all swear an oath, and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing. And they swore they all together and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And they were in all 200 who descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon. And they called it Mount Hermon because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And all the others together with them took unto themselves wives, and each chose for himself one, and they began to go in unto them and to defile themselves with them. And they taught them charms and enchantments and the cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants. And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants who consumed all acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood, and the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. The Book of Enoch. After Christianity took back Spain from the Moors in the 14th century, they wanted to root out all non-Catholic elements in the country and unite it under Catholic rule. The church demanded that hundreds of thousands of Jews convert or leave. Many Jews agreed to convert, and they became known as conversos. The slang or derogatory term given to those who were not totally sincere in their conversion was marranos, which means pigs. They openly followed the Christian faith, but covertly held true to their former identity and agendas in secret. They intermarried with the nobility and rose to the highest ranks in government and the church. And according to Jewish-born author Dr. Henry Mackau, and I quote, "They pretended to belong to a target group, but like the Freemasons, they had handshakes to recognize each other, and they met in secret at night." The founder of the Jesuits was a converso, and so was his successor. The Society of Jesus, as the Jesuits are formally known, was started in the 1530s by Ignatius of Loyola, and he was a Basque soldier who compiled a series of esoteric spiritual exercises, which, when performed, well, they were performed by all of the male order, and there are no Jesuit sisters. So these spiritual exercises consist of mental exercises, meditations, prayers, and other practices which were designed to improve a person's spiritual vitality. Another way of expressing this spiritual or universal force is the Asian term ki or chi. In India, one might come across the word prana, which is said to be controlled through breath and posture and the various forms of yoga. Prana is the Sanskrit word for life force. Vril is another name of this life force energy that theoretically fills the universe and all living beings. Helena Blavatsky, the foundress of the Theosophical Society, described this Vril energy as an ether stream that can be transformed into a physical force. The Vril Society was a secret organization in Germany devoted to mastering this unseen force of nature. They accumulated and combined the guarded alchemical knowledge of this life force that's contained in Sufism, Aryan Hindu mysticism, theosophy, Nordic and Sumerian mythology, pagan sex magic, channeled material, and the Kabbalah. According to esoteric and yogic teachings, sexual energies can be channeled, stored, and harnessed, and Tantra and Kundalini Yoga were two ancient techniques utilized by the German Vril Society. After fleeing Germany in 1933, Dr. Willy Ley, one of the world's greatest rocket experts, said, and I quote, "The Vril Society, which formed shortly before the Nazis came to power, believed that they had secret knowledge that would enable them to change their race and become equals of the men hidden in the bowels of the earth. Methods of concentration, a whole system of internal gymnastics by which they would be transformed. These methods of concentration were probably based on Ignatius Loyola's spiritual exercises. The Jesuit techniques of concentration and visualization are similar to many occult teachings, especially in shamanic cults and Tibetan Buddhism." The Nazis revered these Jesuit spiritual exercises, and they believed that they had been handed down from ancient masters of Atlantis. The occultists of the time knew that Ignatius was a Basque. Some claimed that the Basque people were the last remnant of the Atlantean race, and the proper use of these techniques would enable the reactivation of the Vril. The belief was that the world will change and the lords will emerge from the center of the earth. Unless we have made an alliance with them and become lords ourselves, we shall find ourselves amongst the slaves on the dung heap that will nourish the roots of the new cities that will arise. Effectively suppressed for centuries, a group of Gnostic Gospels were discovered in the Egyptian desert in 1945, now known as the Nag Hammadi Library. This immensely important discovery includes texts that were once thought to have been entirely destroyed during the early Christian struggle to define orthodoxy. Gnosis literally means knowledge, in the context of a spiritual knowledge or divine insight emerging directly from the inside, such as an inner voice, a gut feeling, or conscience, not dependent on any data from one's outside environment. The Knights Templars likely acquired their secrets of Gnosis or internal alchemy and the Kabbalah from several different sources during their nearly 200 years in the Middle East. The stated goal of these sacred and guarded practices is nothing less than to literally evolve the person's consciousness and being into a higher state of existence. This would include the attainment of certain mystical abilities such as clairvoyance, heightened intuition, astral vision, etc. Though the true origin of the Kabbalah is in dispute, in his book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, honorary 33rd degree Freemason Manly P. Hall says that, and I quote, "While the greatest minds of the Jewish and Christian worlds have realized that the Bible is a book of allegories, few seem to have taken the trouble to investigate its symbols and parables. When Moses instituted his mysteries, he is said to have given to a chosen few initiates certain oral teachings which could never be written but were to be preserved from one generation to the next by word of mouth transmission. Those instructions were in the form of philosophical keys by means of which the allegories were made to reveal their hidden significance. These mystic keys to their sacred writings were called by the Jews the Kabbalah. The Knights Templars clearly had a very special relationship with Mary Magdalene, and in fact venerated her as one of their patronesses. The Templars practiced sex magic, and the goddess represented this occult method of attaining divine wisdom. Snakes and owls were also venerated symbols which represented Gnostic wisdom. In Greek mythology, a miniature owl traditionally represents or accompanies Athena, the virgin goddess of wisdom, or Minerva, her incarnation in Roman mythology. Snake goddess figurines, found by the British archaeologist Arthur Evans in 1903, of a woman with an owl perched atop of her head, holding a snake in each hand, have been excavated from known archaeological sites in Crete, dating back from approximately 1600 BC. The Knights Templars also came to venerate the Black Madonna, which to them represented both the attractive power of Venus as well as the hidden secret wisdom of Sophia. Incidentally, the Greek noun Sophia translates to wisdom. This helps to better understand why the Templars brought back numerous Black Madonnas with them from the Holy Land, building Gothic cathedrals around them in Europe, always dedicated to Mary. If you visit a Gothic cathedral today, there's a good chance you'll see a stained glass window decorated with motifs centered around the goddess symbol of the rose, or an actual Black Madonna relic. The goddess tradition is also known as the teaching of the rose. The rose is a symbol of the goddess as well as for alchemy and gnosis, which are branches of the ancient goddess spiritual tradition, and the rose was used as a symbol for Mary as well, as it was also used as an ancient symbol of Venus. My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an author and anthropologist, and would like to invite you to join me in awakening from a long amnesia. Species with amnesia, our forgotten history. Gods with amnesia, subterranean worlds of inner earth. The occult secrets of Vril. And 1666, redemption through sin. I would like to thank my subscribers who share my posts, as I rely on word of mouth, and I appreciate all of the positive feedback, reviews on my books, and I thank you very much for listening. The old man Hassan Sabah, also known as Lord of the Mountain, formed an elite secret society called the School of the Hashishi, or Assassins. A popular theory links the word hashish, which is a term for cannabis, to the word hashishin, implying that they were named after the hash that they allegedly consumed. Unlike alcohol, Islam did not prohibit cannabis. Another hypothesis for the name stems from assassin, which in Arabic means guardians, and some scholars have insisted that this is to be the true origin of the word assassin, guardians of the secrets. In Persia, or modern Iran, from the highest recesses, over 2,100 meters above sea level, of the 1,000-year-old impenetrable mountain fortress of Alamut, meaning eagle's nest, Saba, the Lord of the Mountain, directed a covert brotherhood of fearless, hashish-smoking warriors who were completely dedicated to his undisclosed cause, willing to carry out his every order, and if necessary, die for him willingly and without hesitation. Born in the Persian city of Qom in 1050s, Hassani Sabah preached absolute devotion to a transcendental God. The family who raised him were from the Shia sect, known as the Twelvers. The term Twelver refers to its adherents' belief in the 12 divinely ordained leaders, also known as the 12 Imams, and in the Mahdi, the Guided One, who will return as the Redeemer of Islam and who will rule the world. There's also a branch of Shia Islam whose adherents are known as the Seveners. So they differ from the Twelvers in the identity of their appointed spiritual successor, or Imam, who possesses special political authority over their community. Now, the Bektashi Sufi order shared the esoteric belief in the 12 Imams and was very influential and widespread in the Ottoman Empire. And having numerous lodges scattered throughout Anatolia, they kept their core beliefs secret from outsiders, from non-initiated Muslims, and Hassani Sabah was very well versed in these same core inner alchemical secrets. Within his mountain fortress of Alamut, Lord Sabah built the legendary Garden of Earthly Delights, which would play an important role in the initiation rites of the assassins. The garden lay peacefully secluded in a beautiful valley nestled between two high mountains. Here he had imported exotic plants, birds few had ever seen before, and unusual animals from all over the world. Luxurious palaces of marble and gold, decorated with beautiful paintings and fine silk furniture, surrounded the lush gardens, and streams of milk, wine, and honey allegedly flowed throughout this earthly paradise. while fountains gushed with wine or pure spring water. Lord Sepehr gave his initiates spiked food and drink, and after the powerful potion of opium and hashish knocked them out, they would be carried into the sacred garden while in a deep sleep, and when the initiate awoke from his slumber, a host of young beautiful virgins would greet him, singing and dancing and playing lovely flutes with other instruments for him. As Robert Anton Wilson describes it, and I quote, "Welcome to paradise," they sang as the awakening initiate gazed about in wonder. "By the magic of the holy Lord Hassan, you have entered paradise while still alive." And they fed him exotic imported paradise fruit, far sweeter and stranger than the local fruit he had known before. And they showed him the animals of paradise, imported from as far away as Japan in some cases. Creatures far more remarkable than those ordinarily seen in their local region. The initiate would be covertly fed more hashish and opium during the experience to ensure the maximum effect on his psyche. After this opium was introduced and began to flow into the bloodstream, the young candidate would sleep again. They would then be removed from the Garden of Delights and returned to the banquet hall of Lord Hassan. There they awoke, and after pledging their devotion, became one of the illuminated. This technique proved very effective. Hassan could demand absolute loyalty from his followers with no questions asked. Another version of this story comes to us from Marco Polo, from his visit to Alamut in 1273, and he says, and I quote, "The old man kept at his court such boys of 12 years old as seemed to him destined to become courageous men. When the old man sent them into the garden in groups of 4, 10, or 20, he gave them hashish to drink. They slept, then they were carried sleeping into the garden where he had them awakened. When these young men awoke, they found themselves in the garden with all these marvelous things. They truly believed themselves to be in paradise, and these damsels were always with them in song. They received everything they asked for, so that they would never have left the garden of their own free will. And when the old man wished to kill someone, he would take him and say, 'Go and do this thing. I do this because I want to make you return to the paradise.' And the assassins would go, perform the deed willingly." This was only a small part of Hassan's system, which he had divided into levels or degrees. Sepehr was a noted alchemist, so part of the curriculum for the future assassins involved mastering occult methods for reaching higher planes of consciousness. Of course, they also learned how to properly kill a man with poison or a dagger. Initiates learned multiple languages as well as the dress and manners of merchants, monks, soldiers. Moreover, they learned to fake the beliefs and devotion of every major religion. And in this way, the assassin could pretend to be anyone, from a well-to-do merchant to a Sufi mystic, a Christian, a common soldier. The assassins persisted for over 100 years after Sepehr's death. But the son of Genghis Khan finally sieged and conquered Alamut in 1256. But Sepehr's chief minister was ordered to write a complete history of the assassins based on records in the Alamut library, and this is the work that supplies most of the historical data about the order. During the Crusades, the assassins fought both for and against the Crusaders, likely whichever suited their agenda at the time. So as a result of this contact, the Crusaders brought back to Europe the assassin system, which numerous secret societies in the West would adopt or mimic. The Knights Templars, the Society of Jesus, Priory de Sion, the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, they all owe their organizational efficiency to the old man Hassan. In fact, the Illuminati had their origins in the mystical aspect of the assassin order. And although most equate the Illuminati with the Bavarian Illuminati, it's really a revised version of the assassin system. Even our modern assassination cults like CIA, Mossad, they've incorporated many of the assassins' techniques into their methodologies. And a CIA training manual titled Study of Assassination, it contains traces of the assassin's influence throughout, and the document even mentions Hassan Sabah by name. So, the Mossad former motto happens to be, "By way of deception, thou shalt do war." As I said, the Knights Templar learned how to create a mystery school from these cults, and when the Knights Templar arrived in the Middle East, the Sufis had already established numerous mystery schools, which were a synthesis of those in the ancient world. So the Templars created their own synthetic mystery school known as the Holy Grail Mystery School, and they wove into this mystery school much of the alchemical wisdom that they learned from these various traditions, as well as esoteric wisdom from Kabbalah and both the Greek and Egyptian mystery schools. In his book, originally published in Germany in 1924, The Secret Practices of the Sufi Freemasons, the Islamic Teachings at the Heart of Alchemy, Rudolf von Sepehr purports to deliver inner Masonic practices from the Bektashi order of Sufis. The book is mainly an esoteric interpretation of Masonic hand signs, but it also includes abbreviated letters found at the beginning of some of the Quran's chapters, Arabic letter mysticism, and vow chanting. And he claims that the basic idea of this sect is that there's secrets that are revealed in these words that are made up of sounds or letters with accompanying numerical values, and these are made manifest in the human body through certain exercises that he claims make up essential components at the heart of alchemy. In this context, the word alchemy refers not to converting base metals, but to spiritual alchemy, transformation of the soul. So these almost Qigong-like exercises make up a lengthy initiatory routine based around this Bektashi internal alchemy, and it combines 4 Masonic hand signs with specific vows and accompanying movements. As I said, the Knights Templar adopted these inner alchemy techniques, and the European Freemasons preserved them. Still part of the Masonic mysteries, these Sufi spiritual practices have the goal of transforming the practitioner along the lines of Masonic moral allegory. My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an anthropologist and author, and I invite you to explore some suppressed mysteries with me in an attempt to unlock their riddles which have eluded any serious consideration in mainstream academia. A magus, or magi for plural, was a Zoroastrian astrologer priest from ancient Persia or modern Iran, from which we get the term magic and magician. In Western mythology, they have been referred to as sorcerers and wizards or shamans. In Farsi, the Indo-European or Aryan language spoken in Iran, magi was the original term for fire worshipper. They were the guardians of the sacred and eternal fire, or a flame or altar fire, which remains lit inside their temple 24 hours a day for millennia.
This Zoroastrian fire temple in Yazd is a place of worship and increasingly a popular tourist destination. It's home to the Atash Beram, the fire of victory, which has burned for over 1,500 years, a centerpiece of the world's oldest monotheistic religion.
The ancient Chaldeans regarded fire and the sun itself as symbolic for spiritual light. These enigmatic people lived in Mesopotamia around 800 BC and ruled Babylon from 625 to 539 BC. They were always renowned as ancient astronomers and highly respected astrologers. So for now, let us briefly examine some of their celestial mysteries which may still have a covert, hidden, or forgotten influence over us today. The planets can be distinguished from all other stars in the sky because they change their position slightly against the background stars from one night to the next, and their brightness varies in a regular cycle over a period of time. Where all other points of light seem to move together in a fixed position in relation to each other, there are 5 visible planets that can be observed and followed from Earth using the naked eye, which move independently and seem to wander around on their own. The ancient Greeks referred to them as planetes asteris, which means wandering stars, and is from where the word planet is derived. So in addition to the 5 celestial wanderers or planets, we have the sun and the moon, which obviously also move independently and seemingly do their own thing in respect to the other fixed stars, which gives us a grand total of 7. Thus, these 7 came to be known as the 7 old gods of the Babylonians: Shamash the sun, Sin the moon, Nebo was Mercury, Ishtar was Venus, Nergal was Mars, Marduk was Jupiter, and E was Saturn. To the Hebrews, they were the archangels: Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Samuel, Uriel, Amiel, Zadkiel. To the early Christians, they were the angels of the 7 churches. They were represented among the Jews, Babylonians, Egyptians, and Persians by the 7 branched candlesticks known as the menorah, or their 7 flamed altar fires. Our days of the week were named after the planets of Hellenistic astrology, and by Hellenistic I mean relating to Greek or Macedonian history, from the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC to the defeat of Cleopatra and Mark Antony by Octavian in 31 BC. So during this period, Greek culture flourished, and we can see the 7-day week spread throughout the Roman Empire. Mars was Ares, Mercury, Hermes, Jupiter was Zeus, Venus was Aphrodite, and Saturn is Kronos, and of course the sun and the moon. Where the sun and fire symbolically represented spiritual light, the 7 planetary deities also had an esoteric, occult significance. Calendars and cycles of time were very important for things like agriculture and navigation, but there was another equally practical aspect to astrotheology, which definitely falls into the realm of internal alchemy, or let's call it spirituality, which is the true secret of all the solar mysteries, without exception. In the words of occultist Manly P. Hall, honorary 33rd degree Freemason,
we begin our problem this evening with the problem or study of the 7 deities, or as Plutarch refers to the mystery, the 7-rayed God. Why was the 7 so vastly significant a number in ancient times? How does it happen that this number coincides with what the ancients called their planets, consisting of 5 planets we know today and 2 luminaries? These 7 bodies in peculiarly close relationship to the earth and appearing to move around it have for the longest period that we know been highly symbolical and highly significant in relation to theology. These 7 wanderers, these 7 planets, by the Egyptians, by the Persians, the Hindus, the Chinese, the Greeks, and many other peoples, particularly perhaps even the Babylonians, These 7 planets were always identified with 7 deities. These 7 deities, in all these different groups, divided and organized themselves in practically the same patterns. And the powers of these deities, regardless of the names by which they were known, were identical. Thus the number 7 comes to us with a tremendous and almost awe-inspiring pressure of validity. But we also know that in the Buddhist doctrine there were 7 primary Buddhistic powers. These 7, the great eternal bodhisattvas, are never represented, however, in their fullness. We have only 5. We have the mention of 7 Dhyana Buddhas, but we only have pictorial presentation of 5, arranged in the form of a hollow square with the 5th in the center. Now the Greeks had the same subterfuge of using 5 and 2 in a very strange combination. Philo-Judaeus tells us that the 7 planetary gods were the vowels, or the 7 powers of sound. Is it not interesting, therefore, that we are still having trouble with our 7 vowels? We only recognize 5. And we have a funny old doggerel verse that has been used in school for a long time. The vowels are A, E, I, O, and U, sometimes W and Y. We've never been able to quite arrange this W-Y situation. We have, however, the 5 vowels that we know. So this 5 again appears. And wherever this 5 appears, it has been tied to the planetary mystery. From the earliest studies of numerology, back in the classical period when folks really took it seriously, and at the time when it was applied directly to certain classic alphabets. And this is important because in ancient times men paginated and numeralized by means of letters, which we no longer do. Therefore pages were lettered instead of numbered, and every letter had its numerical equivalent, unvarying. We do not have this in English. But according to Pythagoras, the number 7 was the number of law. It was the number of the universe. It was the number of the gods and of the immutable principles which lie at the root of existence. Irenaeus tells us that one of the old Gnostic symbols of Christ showed the head of the Savior surrounded by a halo of 7 rays. These rays, assumedly representing the 7 powers, the Messianic dispensation. We learn in the book of Revelation of 7 churches which are in Asia. And these, of course, carry very closely to the 7 chakras of the Tantric Vedantic system in India. And the moment we go into the problem of the 7 chakras, we come again into the 5-7 difficulty. Because our systems in Asia break up, some systems insisting that there are only 5 of these centers, and the other systems representing 5 developed out of 7 and 2 in potential. So we come back to this strange number again. And this number constantly fights the struggle between the 5 planets and the 7 members of the solar system anciently known and recognized. In the ancient Kabbalah, the creating fiat or word was spoken in the form of the 7 vowels, 2 of which again were mystery vowels or secret letters which could not be known, and for the deficiency of which the great name could not be restored, captured, or preserved. In the Jewish early works in Genesis, we find in the opening chapters the Elohim. And the Elohim are the 7 creating powers of the great deity who is said to have fashioned the world in the opening chapters of Genesis. These are the spirits of God that moved upon the face of the deep. Their number is identical with that of the Armonian artificers of Egypt. They were the powers or creating attributes released by the speaking of the word of creation. And this word was always a word composed of vowels. So we go back to the mystery of the 5-7 vowels. All these things point to some kind of a doctrine, which frankly and obviously is very difficult to trace after so long a time, but it meant something and had a very clear and definite bearing upon the entire structure of the universal organization as it was known to the ancients. Pythagoras, in defining this mystery of the seven, goes on to relate it to the seven powers of universal generation. And in explaining this, he tells us, and Plato later corroborates him, that the soul was a numerical mystery patterned in the geometry of seven. That the soul of man actually consisted of 7 parts and an 8th sphere. Now this 8th sphere also arises in the ancient religious doctrine. The 8th sphere appears in the Gnosis and in the recent discovery of Gnostic books in Egypt, probably the most important religious find in the modern world, far more important than the Dead Sea Scrolls. These books, incidentally, were found earlier, slightly earlier than the Dead Sea Scrolls, but are not as well known. In this Gnostic collection, we have a very great deal of information bearing upon the esoteric use of numbers and of the various deities and principles that are represented by them. Now, if you go back to Revelation for a moment, you will come to the 7 lamps and the great figure that moves among them. And we know that in the tabernacle and temple rites of the old Jews, the 7-branched candlestick is the symbol of the 7 planets.
An occult explanation can be found for the 12 months of the year, which at one point were 10 months, and they were extended to 12. This is why October is the 10th month of the year in the modern-day Gregorian calendar. The month kept its original name from octo, which means 8 in Latin. An octagon has 8 sides, an octopus has 8 tentacles, but October is now the 10th month. And December, which means 10, the prefix DEC means 10, became the 12th month. The number 12 has had a significant occult meaning in various cultures throughout the world, and one reason is the lunar cycle, the cycle of the moon, which is often symbolically linked to the 12-month menstrual cycle, almost universally tied into the lunar symbology since the Pleistocene or Ice Age. It is clear that women were not always so disrespected as they are today, and this cycle was at one time very, very sacred and revered, where in modern times it's labeled as unclean and basically taboo. 12 represents the division or fractioning of unity into 12 parts. An ancient civilization, which likely spanned the entire globe, wanted to make sure a connection to this divine number was never lost. We can see the 12 labors of Hercules, 12 sons of Romulus, 12 knights of King Arthur's Round Table, 12 followers of Buddha, 12 followers of Quetzalcoatl, 12 tribes of Israel. We read about the 12 brothers of Joseph, the 12 great patriarchs, 12 disciples of Christ. The tree of life bears 12 fruits. And even Himmler and his 12 knights in the Nazi SS. So it's clear there's occult significance. 12 inches in a foot, 12 days of Christmas, 12 grades in school, and of course, the 3 important cycles of the day, year, and great year. which have the day and night divided into 12 hours, the 12 months of the solar year, and 12 zodiac ages of the great precessional year, respectively. So let's consult Manly P. Hall again and see what kind of insight he can shed on this.
Now, in Greek mythology, there was a group called the Titans. And the Titans are the ones who stole Dionysus, or Zagreus, the son of Zeus, took him out into the fields of space, killed him, boiled his body, and ate the flesh. And when this occurred, Zeus, becoming aware of the smell of the fire in which they were cooking the body of his son, turned his attention, his one eye, which, like the eye of Otan, was the eye that saw all, turned this eye upon the Titans in chaos, perceived their crime, and launched his thunderbolt upon them, in which he destroyed the 12 primordial forces. He then took the ashes of these forces, containing within these ashes the burned blood of his own son, and from these ashes formed the bodies of mankind. Therefore, man contained within himself the 12 titanic principles and the blood of Bacchus. And the sacraments and ceremonies relating to this are part of the Greek mystery of the Eucharist. Now, in this situation, the Titans, astrologically and astrotheologically, represent the primordial power of the 12 constellations. This term, precession of the equinoxes, to one completely unfamiliar with the subject, is just a little difficult to explain briefly. Each year, the sun reaches the equinox slightly sooner than the year before. That actually the coming of the sun is a little over 1 minute earlier each year, making an astronomical degree in about 72 years. Thus, every 72 years, the sun seems to drop back at the equinox 1 degree. If it so does, it drops back approximately 30 degrees every 2160 years. And it drops back around the entire circle to any hypothetical point in one longer cycle of 25,920 years. In this period of time, the sun seems, only by appearance, seems to drop back around the entire circle of the zodiac, falling backward or fading backward at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years. This has been a very important time pattern, and the complete precession of the equinoxes, requiring 25,920 years, is referred to as the Great Platonic Year. And this peculiar heavenly motion has significance in a very wonderful way, and is perhaps the most important link that we have between astronomy and religion in ancient times. The precession of the equinox, therefore, means that every 2160 years the sun reaches the equinoctial point in a different sign of the zodiac, each sign constituting 30 degrees. If this occurs, then, we see the appearance of the precession, in which the sun appears to enter each sign in its last degree, and by precession move backward through it to its first degree, and then pass into the next sign, entering that at its last degree and moving back to the first. This peculiar observation, the study of the Platonic year, has led to a great many wonderful symbols and philosophies. The first stargazers on their tall towers or ziggurats in the land of Babylon, these stargazers were astronomer priests. There was no differentiation between science and religion.
My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an author and anthropologist and would like to invite you to join me in awakening from a long amnesia. Species with Amnesia, Our Forgotten History. Gods with Amnesia, Subterranean Worlds of Inner Earth. The Occult Secrets of Vril. And 1666, Redemption Through Sin.
The Lion Man of Hohenstein-Stratel was found in 1931 in Germany. It is a delicate figurine made from mammoth ivory and dated to about 38,000 years ago. It features the head of a lion on a human body and is one of the oldest known zoomorphic or animal-shaped sculptures in the world. This Sumerian figurine is about 5,000 years old and is also part human and part lion. This one considered by most to be a lioness. It was discovered near Baghdad and sold to a private collection for just over $57 million in 2007. Sculptures of unions of different elements into one symbol were common to the ancient Mesopotamians, Egyptians, and Greeks. The image of the Sphinx depicted the body of a lion and the head of a human, while the harpies of Greek mythology showed bird-like human women. This is called a lamassu. The word was used by the Assyrian and Akkadians based on the earlier Sumerian word lama, which was the goddess of protection. She was also the goddess of intercession, which means to intervene on behalf of another. So she acted as an intermediary between the Sumerians and the gods. The ancient Mesopotamians typically prominently placed the lamassu at the entrances of cities and palaces, and from the front they appear to stand, but from the side, walk. This is the world-famous Louvre Museum in Paris, France. Let's take a look inside, shall we? Although the Louvre carries some fine examples of Sumerian art featuring beautiful lamassu statues, they are just replicas. To see the real thing these days, one must go to Berlin. This is the Pergamon Museum in Germany, and now that we are in the presence of some authentic lamassus, let's take a closer look and inspect the statue's symbology. The ox representing Taurus, the lion representing Leo, the eagle representing Scorpio, and the man or angel representing Aquarius. In Western astrology, the four symbols are associated with the elements of earth, fire, water, and air, respectively. The same way that our solar year was divided into 12 parts, we call months, the ancients knew of another cycle which Plato called the Great Year, which lasted roughly 25,000 years and was also divided into 12 parts, or astrological ages, lasting about 2,150 years each, which is also referred to as a great month, or precessional age. The term great year is defined by NASA as, and I quote, the period of one complete cycle of the equinoxes around the ecliptic.
In other words, the time it takes for the sun to travel through each of the 12 houses of the zodiac, which is called the precession of the equinox. And to learn about why this happens, please refer to my video presentation on astrotheology. And that's a word which simply means the celestial or astrological influence on religion. For now, I'd like to draw your attention to these 4 astrological symbols, which incidentally are represented in ancient Egyptian culture as canopic jars. They were intended as containers for the internal organs removed from mummies, but also represent these same 4 signs. Richard Hinckley Allen explains in his 1899 book, In Star Names and Their Meanings, that the Great Sphinx of Giza was constructed, and I quote, with Virgo's head on Leo's body, from the fact that the sun passes through these 2 constellations during the inundation of the Nile. So the Great Sphinx aligns perfectly towards cardinal east, reflecting the significance of the 4 cardinal directions in the Old Kingdom. During the process of mummifications, 4 organs were placed by the ancient Egyptians in special containers, and these jars were personified by the 4 different gods known as the sons of Horus, associated with these same cardinal signs. So what is it with these specific 4 signs, 4 fixed signs? Why are they so important? These same 4 signs are regarded in Christianity as the 4 living creatures of the prophet Ezekiel. They are also found biblically as the 4 evangelists and the 4 beasts of Revelation. So what I'm asking you is, why these 4 signs? Why not some other signs? Well, to try and solve this riddle, let's first reflect on some statements made by 2 very famous men in the occult to see if we can gain some insight, or at least some better context before we proceed. In his book Morals and Dogma, the 33rd degree Freemason, Albert Pike, said, and I quote, "Masonry, like all religions, all the mysteries, Hermeticism and alchemy, conceals its secrets to all except the adept and sages or the elect, and uses false explanations and misinterpretations of its symbols to mislead those who deserve only to be misled, to conceal the truth, which it calls light, from them, and to draw them away from it." End quote. In his book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, honorary 33rd degree Freemason Manly P. Hall says, and I quote, "Symbols may both reveal and conceal, for to the wise the subject of symbols is obvious, while to the ignorant the figure remains inscrutable. Hence, he who seeks to unveil the secret doctrine of antiquity must search for that doctrine not upon the pages of books which might fall onto the hands of the unworthy, but in the place where it was originally concealed." End quote. In other words, there's a lot of room for error and misinterpretation when symbols are not properly understood, especially when the true meaning is purposely concealed. That said, many Christians or people who consider themselves biblical experts all around the world today interpret the Bible as saying that the earth is only 6,000 years old. And while many of my former anthropology professors got a kick out of basically making fun of the people who subscribe to that, they themselves interpreted the Bible as stating the same thing. So even though they didn't believe it, they still thought they are still ignorant to the actual intended meaning. So let us once again review the solar year, which can be divided into 4 parts with 2 solstices one the longest day of the year at summer, and one at the opposite time of the year when the night is the longest, at the winter solstice, at around Christmas time. So there are 2 points called equinoxes, and those are when the length of the day is equal. And this also comes down to us as familiar holidays. So if we do the same thing and apply these 4 points over the great year, which is roughly 25,000 years long, we get 4 sections with points represented by zodiac constellations or astrological ages that cover a little over 2,000 years each. And so each of the 4 sections would be a bit over 6,000 years each. Now these 4 signs are fixed, and by that I mean there is an exact astronomical date of when these 4 signs were the 4 cardinal points, because they're always changing. For example, now as I'm posting this video, the 4 cardinal signs of the zodiac are Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn. So to reiterate my question, when are the cardinal signs Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, and Aquarius? To unlock the secret to this mystery, we must once again turn to the occult, a word which literally means secret. And we find out that what the Bible was referring to 6,000 years ago was the start of an age, not the start of the world or the start of all of life or some other hasty or unsophisticated interpretation. And the more one looks into this, the clearer this becomes. The swastika is probably the most ancient emblem of the solar year, as well as Plato's great year. The legendary Aryans were, philosophically speaking, a solar race, their most sacred sign being the swastika, the best known of all solar symbols. And Ares, while being venerated as a war god, was also regarded as a solar deity in the astrotheological context, and the age of Aries was around 2000 BC, which is why expansions at that time into India by these sun-worshipping, horse-riding, swastika-carrying, blonde and blue-eyed Aryans, they were famous for their horses, and there are no horses or chariots in India's fossil record until these Aryans introduced them to the subcontinent, as they also introduced Sanskrit itself to India. As I said, the Aryans entered India during the Holocene from the north, and we find evidence of this etched in stone thousands of years ago in Iran. From the inscription at the tomb of Darius the Great, and I quote, "I am Darius, the great king, the king of kings, the king of many countries and many people, the king of this expansive land, Persian, the son of a Persian, Aryan, from the Aryan race," end quote. Now, no matter how hard one tries, you will not find the word Indo-European anywhere. And that's because it does not exist in reality. It exists in the politically correct minds of social engineers at the United Nations, but what is etched in stone is the word Aryan. So to some degree in India, there still remains this ethnic caste system that was imposed on them by the Aryans, who are regarded as the nobility, even though the word does not mean nobility. As I just explained, it comes from the age of Aries. So let's see how this bears out. I'd like you to listen to this short introduction from the original Conan the Barbarian movie. And in light of what we just went over, you may or may not have heard this before, but let's see if it makes sense to you. See if you can figure out the time period that the narrator tries to set the stage for. He doesn't give you any numerical dates, so pay attention. And in the comment section, I'd like you to please tell me when this movie takes place based on what you're about to hear. So listen closely. So he said, between the time when the oceans drank Atlantis, which according to yours truly is at the end of the Pleistocene age and the start of the Holocene age. It's a very important time, geologically speaking. There were rapidly melting ice caps, rising sea levels, mass extinctions, etc. He also says, and the rise of the sons of Arius, there was an age undreamed of. So the sons of Arius are the Aryans, and their rise was when? That's the question. And if you can answer it, many mysteries will unravel, especially the ones that many have tried to hide. The same era that saw the introduction of the horse to India was the same as when the horse was introduced to Egypt via the Middle East by the Hyksos, which to the Egyptians meant foreign rulers. The ancient Egyptians hated them, and when they had their civil war and expelled the Hyksos, which comes down to us as the Exodus story in the Bible, the Egyptians removed their names from every single stone in Egypt, which is why nobody seems to know who they were. They actually chiseled away every single reference to this dynasty. Ironically, their lineage are now the most famous of the pharaohs because their tombs were so well hidden, and that's why we know about them. These quote-unquote Aryans that entered India, they also entered Egypt around the same time, but unlike India, they were expelled after a couple of centuries. And this same blue-eyed statues that we see in Mesopotamia, they're mirrored in the blue-eyed statues of ancient Egyptian pharaohs, all of which predate Alexander the Great and have absolutely nothing to do with his Macedonian Ptolemy line. My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an author and anthropologist and would like to invite you to join me in awakening from a long amnesia. Ethiopia is located in the Horn of Africa, sharing a border with Somalia, Sudan, and Kenya. With over 100 million inhabitants, it is second only to Nigeria in population in Africa and is home to many important archaeological sites. Ethiopia is primarily studied by anthropologists who are searching for early hominid remains, but as the only African country to defeat a European colonial power and retain its sovereignty, it has also managed to retain a considerable amount of its ancient history, which for the most part has unfortunately been altered or erased altogether in nations which had succumbed to colonialism. One example is the Book of Enoch, which has portions such as the Book of the Watchers that dates back to at least 300 BC, that describes the fall of the Watchers, who are the fallen angels that fathered the Nephilim, and it is asserted in the writing itself that its author was Enoch, who biblically speaking was Noah's great-grandfather that had lived at a time before the biblical flood. These stories were banned as heretical from most Bibles, but remained in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Now, the Book of Enoch describes a number of cavities or hollow valleys deep inside the earth's crust. Chapter 22 of the Book of Enoch states, and I quote, "And then I went to another place, and he showed me in the west another great and high mountain of hard rock. And there were 4 hollow places in it, deep and very smooth. 3 of them were dark and 1 bright, and there was a fountain of water in its midst. And I said, how smooth are these hollow places, and deep and dark." Carved right out of solid rock, the Church of St. George is one of 11 monolithic churches in Lalibela, a city in northern Ethiopia regarded as sacred to many. They were built right into the stone, which was chiseled out, forming doors, windows, columns, floors, roofs, and even includes an extensive system of drainage ditches, trenches, and ceremonial passages, some with openings to hermit caves and catacombs. Dated to around the 12th century, their construction is attributed to King Lalibela, who set out to build a new Jerusalem after Islamic conquest halted Christian or Knights Templar pilgrimages to the Holy Land. Some legends say that angels helped in their construction. It's very interesting to take note of the swastika-shaped windows carved right from the rock, as well as some of the other symbols that are present on the inside of these stone churches, which are rarely shown on documentaries or even discussed at a university level in classrooms. Herodotus, in his work The Histories from 5th century BC, portrayed the Scythians as people who drank from the skulls of their enemies. Similar traditions were described for China in the 1st and 2nd centuries BC, and for Viking tribes by Magnus Olufsen, written in 1636. Discovered in the Goes Cave in Somerset, UK, this is said to be the earliest directly dated human skull cup ever found at approximately 14,700 years old. Human skull bowls were fashioned from the oval upper section of a human cranium and used as a cup. This practice is performed as a ritual in some sects of Tibetan Buddhism, where blood is consumed from the decorated human skull known as a kapala, which means skull in Sanskrit, as the practice is also known in Hindu Tantra. The skulls are usually from other deceased monks, but not always, and the purpose it is done is sometimes symbolic in some cases, but it's also often described to be for enlightenment purposes. When used for esoteric rituals, the history of the cranium's original owner can often have important bearing on the ritual's potency. The skull of a murderer or execution victim is believed to possess greater tantric power, for example, than the skull of one who has died from an accidental death or from an illness, let's say. The skull of someone who died peacefully in old age has virtually no occult power. Having the greatest potency are skulls of children who died during the onset of puberty. Plutarch said, "Man was made of earth, but the power that made a human body grow was the moon, source of menstrual blood." The lives of the very gods were dependent on the miraculous power of menstrual blood. In Greece, it was euphemistically called the supernatural red wine, given to the gods by Mother Hera. The esoteric secret of the gods was that their mystical powers of longevity, authority, and creativity came from the same female essence. The Norse god Thor, for example, reached the magic land of enlightenment and eternal life by bathing in a river filled with the menstrual blood of a giantess. Odin acquired supremacy by stealing and drinking the wise blood from the triple cauldron in the womb of the Mother Earth. Odin's theft of menstrual magic paralleled that of Indra, who stole the ambrosia of immortality in the same way. Indian myth, according to some occult interpretations, called this sacred fluid soma. Soma was drunk by priests at sacrificial ceremonies and mixed with milk as a healing charm. Therefore, it wasn't milk. Soma was especially revered on Samvara or Monday, the day of the moon, which has been, a documented symbol for a woman's monthly cycle since the Pleistocene, or Ice Age. Tantric worship of menstrual blood penetrated the Greco-Roman world way before the Christian era and was well established in the Gnostic period. This worship provided what they called a spiritual marriage, and it was practiced by Gnostic Christians like the Ophites. And another name for this was the way of Shaktism, meaning tantric yoni worship. Shaktism was declared a heresy before the 7th century AD, and subsequently the spiritual marriage, or love feast as it was also called, disappeared, and women were completely forbidden direct participation in Christian worship, and the menstrual mysteries basically went underground. Egyptian pharaohs became divine by ingesting the blood of Isis, a soma-like ambrosia called Sa. Its hieroglyphic sign was the same as the sign of the vulva, a yonic loop. And to many secret societies that go all the way back to ancient Egypt, the Holy Grail in its true original essence is the womb. It's still specified in the left-hand rite of Tantra that the priestess impersonating the goddess must be menstruating. In India, where menstrual blood is known as the Kula flower or Kula nectar, when a girl first menstruates, she's said to have borne the flower. In Chinese religion of Tao, the Way, they taught tantric doctrines, which later were supplanted by patriarchal philosophies. But the Taoists said a man could gain mystical insight, creativity, and wisdom, and in some cases become immortal, or at least very long-lived, by absorbing menstrual blood, called red yin juice, from a woman's mysterious gateway, otherwise known as the Grotto of the White Tiger, a symbol of life-giving female energy. So Chinese sagas call this red juice the essence of Mother Earth, the yin principle that gives life to all things, and they even claim that the Yellow Emperor became a god by absorbing the yin juice of 1,200 women. Taoist China considered red a sacred color associated with women, blood, sexual potency, and creative power. White was the color of men, semen, passivity, and death. Menstrual blood is full of stem cells, and in 2005, Thomas Rando at Stanford University in California and his team found that young blood returned the liver and skeletal stem cells of old mice to a much more youthful state during tests. The old mice were able to repair injured muscles as well as the young mice. So spooky things also happened in the opposite direction too. So when young mice received old blood, they appeared to age prematurely, and in some cases injured muscles did not heal as fast as would be expected. So we even see cases such as billionaire PayPal founder Peter Thiel, who believes transfusions of blood from young people can reverse his own aging process, and he allegedly pays $40,000 a quarter for blood transfusions from an 18-year-old by a California company called Ambrosia. So In light of these scientific findings, it seems that the general public is starting to reconsider old stories which were generally regarded as myth, such as those involving vampires, and in more modern times, secret occult blood rituals, which allegedly involve royalty and other initiated elite. The tongkori is a plucked string instrument played by the Ainu people of northern Japan, and it generally has 5 strings, which are not stopped or fretted, but simply played open. The instrument is typically constructed of a single piece of wood from the evergreen tree, approximately a meter long. Its shape is traditionally said to resemble a woman's body, and a pebble is placed within the body cavity of the instrument, granting it a soul. By the 1970s, the instrument was practically extinct, but is experiencing a revival along with the increased interest in Ainu heritage. The Ainu people are the indigenous inhabitants of Hokkaido. They're also present on Sakhalin, the island off the east coast of Russia, as well as northern Honshu, Japan's biggest island. The modern Ainu population is estimated to have dwindled down to around 24,000 people, and until the 20th century, there were at least 19 dialects of the Ainu languages. Only the Hokkaido variant survives, and the Endangered Languages Project puts the current number of native speakers at just 10, though attempts are being made to revive it. Modern Ainu generally have lighter skin complexion, more body hair, are slightly taller, and have higher bridged noses than most Japanese. The ancient Ainu ate raw salmon that was thinly sliced and used wasabi to preserve it. So it may be that the Ainu people showed the Japanese sashimi, not to mention the harpoons the Japanese still use. Anthropologist C. Loring Brace of the University of Michigan has studied the skeletons of about 1,100 Japanese, Ainu, and other Asian ethnic groups, and has concluded that the revered samurai of Japan are of the Ainu. According to Dr. Brace, and I quote, "This explains why the facial features of the Japanese ruling class are so often unlike those of typical modern Japanese. The Ainu-related samurai achieved such power and prestige in medieval Japan that they intermarried with royalty and nobility, passing on Jomon Ainu blood in the upper classes." Now, anthropologist Marvin Harris believed the Japanese custom of whiteface was an emulation of these early noblemen. That said, the oldest known ceramic pots discovered in Japan are not made by the Ainu, but by the Jomon people. So who were they?
Anthropologists called them Asiatic Caucasoids because they had facial features and body hair that seemed more European than Asian. In fact, the Ainu are thought to be a remnant of a very ancient population that was once widespread in the Old World.
This is 28,000 years from China.
What we know of these early Asians is based on just a few skulls.
It's one of the earliest anatomically modern Homo sapiens in Asia.
One of them is a 28,000-year-old specimen from China, which looks very much like the 9,000-year-old Spirit caveman.
And there are some marked similarities in the facial architecture.
Tremendous similarity in the shapes of the eye orbits, in the sense that they're both somewhat rectangular, similar interorbital distance, overall appearance of the orbits, shape of the nose. But many of the features, including the very heavy mandible and the prominent symphysis here, those features are very much the same.
Hiroshi Oshima, the former Japanese ambassador to Germany during World War II, believed that the noble castes in Japan, the daimyo and the samurai, were descended from gods of celestial origin, which was similar to the Nazis' own belief that the Nordic race did not evolve, but came directly down from heaven to settle on the Atlantic continent. A swastika crossed by two arrows, within a shield and surmounted by a royal crown on an orange background, was used as the coat of arms of the samurai Hasekuru Tsunaga in the early 17th century. The swastika symbol is seen frequently in Japan. Its ancient ties to Buddhism's and pre-Buddhist philosophies' civilizing spread throughout 3/4 of Asia is well documented. The symbol is depicted facing both directions and most common in a spiritual context, such as on Shinto and on other temples. While the term Buddhism applies to a religious philosophy founded by Gautama Buddha, the core goals, such as enlightenment achieved through various meditation and yogic practices, or a self-realization and the attempt to conquer the birth and death cycle, known as reincarnation and karma, this existed before Gautama's lifetime, 2,500 years ago, then known as the Aryan path. This influence can still be seen in places like Thailand, the land of smiles, which managed to escape colonialism and the eradication of its history, which often comes with colonialism. And that's why all the depictions of Buddha still have blue eyes, in addition to the usual swastika symbols. So where then were the ancestors of the modern Japanese, Thai, Chinese, and other populations who now reside where ancient Aryans or Caucasoids once inhabited? During the last ice age, global sea levels were much lower, as hundreds of feet of water was trapped in the form of frozen glaciers, so many islands, such as those in the Pacific, were exposed and had much larger land masses, which were presumably populated.
And a Japanese researcher investigating underwater rock formations claims they are the remnants of an ancient Asian civilization that disappeared under the sea off the coast of Yonaguni Island. It's very fascinating. Let's take a look.
The search for the ruins of a mysterious lost city called Mu, thought to have sunk somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, has captivated the popular imagination of adventurers for years. But many scientists dismiss the hypothetical lost world of Mu as sheer fantasy. But one Japanese marine geologist believes he has found ruins in the waters off southern Japan that may have been the basis of these tales. Undaunted amidst persistent skepticism, Musaki Kimura has worked for decades on proving that a group of extraordinary rock formations off Japan's southernmost island of Yonaguni are actually the foundations of an ancient city that disappeared into the Pacific over 4,000 years ago. In a 1985 underwater dive, he noticed that some of the rocks seemed unnaturally smooth and formed a stone staircase close to the island shores. After many additional dives, Kimura says he has found irregular rock formations over a square kilometer from its shores, and even a road through rubble accumulated at the bottom of the ocean. He believes this is nothing more than evidence of man-made ruins of a submerged city.
In my estimation, the structure like a castle is situated right in the middle of the city, which prevails over 1 square kilometer from there. And though not as big as the castle, a lot of ruins of shrine-like structures have been discovered also.
Kimura says he believes the city had a castle, a shrine, a triumphal arch, statues, and even a colosseum when the city was above water.
Judging by the design and the disposition of the ruins, the city must have looked just like an ancient Roman city. I can envision that a triumphal arch-like statue stood on the left side of the Colosseum, and a shrine over the hill.
Kimura believes the city sunk in an earthquake, but this theory has received harsh criticism from many scientists who say the ruins can be accounted for by natural phenomena, such as tidal and volcanic activity. They also say few artifacts, such as clay pots or weapons, have been found at the site. But this is not stopping Kimura from looking for more evidence, confirming his belief in the ancient submerged civilization.
So what do you think? Could there be a lost continent of Mu, as postulated by British writer James Churchward? According to Churchward, Mu extended from somewhere north of Hawaii to the south as far as the Fijis and Easter Island. He claimed Mu was the site of another earlier Garden of Eden and the home of millions of inhabitants that flourished 50,000 years ago, now lost and submerged under the melted glaciers of the Pleistocene, with the survivors competing for new land, all into the Holocene. My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an author and anthropologist, and would like to invite you to join me in awakening from a long amnesia. Species with amnesia, our forgotten history. Gods with amnesia, subterranean worlds of inner earth. The occult secrets of Vril. And 1666, redemption through sin. The Azores are a group of 9 spectacular islands located in the center of the Atlantic Ocean, which resemble many of the descriptions of a fabled lost island in the Atlantic. Terceira is one of the larger islands with a population of 56,000 inhabitants and is located in the historical capital of the archipelago, now a UNESCO heritage site. Many people are unaware that over 140 pyramids are currently being studied by archaeologists in the Madalena area of the Pico Islands of the Azores. Some of these structures reach about 13 meters, that's about 43 feet high, which is equivalent to a 4-story building, and they seem to be aligned deliberately. The landscape features a volcano, the Ponto de Pico, which is the highest mountain in the Azores and Portugal, and the highest elevation of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. The pyramids, which are built with basalt volcanic rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, may possibly predate the arrival of Portuguese or Spanish by many millennia. Discoveries so far have included hooks, metal spikes, bones, shells, weights for fishing nets, utensils made of basalt, coal fragments and pieces of pottery. And this is all in the first official archaeological surveys that are authorized by the Azores regional government to the pyramid structures of the island. So these pyramids are almost all concentrated in an area of 6 kilometers in the district of Magdalena near the west coast of the island, dominated by the highest mountain. And this is about 2,350 meters. So far, archaeologists are very enthusiastic about the deposits of ancient artifacts that they found, and it seems that these artifacts are definitely constructed much earlier than 1427, which is the date of the discovery of the Azores by the Portuguese. And according to Professor Nuno Ribeiro, an archaeologist who is performing surveys on the site, and I quote, "It's an archaeological complex that includes organized pyramidal buildings that create a large square. This organization of space cannot be explained simply by the clearing of the land for agricultural purposes, so it would have required great planning and involved collective labor and several years to build." Ribeiro goes on to add, and I quote, "More amazing is the fact that these structures satisfy the same guidelines of other pyramids around the world, with apparent astronomical motivations also suggesting burial rituals." End quote. Romeo Hristov, an archaeologist at the University of Texas at Austin, Texas, had visited the Pico pyramids with the following observation, and I quote, "The structures of Pico are very perfect, imply a huge amount of work that is justified not only by the needs of agriculture, but there's a strict astronomical orientation and access ramps associated with the concept of the sacred structure stairs." End quote. The Department of Archaeoastronomy did some geomapping and concluded that most of the pyramids are oriented towards the southeast and northwest. Southeast is the direction of the volcano on Pico Island, but more importantly, northwest corresponds to the setting of the sun on the summer solstice, which happens on the island of Faial, very close to Pico. Now, the remaining pyramids have a perpendicular orientation to the first, and Fernando Pimenta, who's the director of the organization, admits that, and I quote, "It seems to be intentional, not just a coincidence, the geographical orientation of the buildings and the site selection for its implementation." End quote. So when we consider that sea levels have risen over 300 feet since the late Pleistocene, or the end of the last ice age, then it could be said that the Azores Islands could represent the mountaintops of whatever landmass this was during the Ice Age. So let's go ahead and call it Atlantis, since it has a nice ring to it, and it seems to have this ocean named after it. The Azores are also situated on what geologists call the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which is where new ocean floor spreads out in the form of hot magma. Lava and magma are the same thing. When it's underground, it's called magma. When it's outside, it's called lava. And this is also where two massive tectonic plates meet. So, in other words, we should also take into account that in addition to rising sea levels, there's an actual rising and lowering of these plates at this point in conjunction with the perpetual volcanic activity that is relatively normal in this area. One typical spring day, sailor Diocleciano Silva was sailing his yacht in the Azores near Portugal. He was startled to find that his GPS equipment was picking up something unusual. It registered a large, perfectly square object below. Very unusual indeed. Whatever this thing was, it had the surprisingly similar geometric resemblance to a pyramid, but was submerged 40 meters off the coast of Terceira. Estimated at 60 meters tall and symmetrically even, the Global Positioning Satellite Imaging recorded that the structure was not only in the shape of a pyramid, but apparently oriented by the cardinal points. So this is where things get really interesting.
40 meters under the water, in between the third island and St. Michael's. The base is higher than a football field. The pyramid was detected by the sailor here mentioned. He mentions that it's very impressive due to its form and its orientation. I mean, the vertices are all north and south, so they're literally, correctly, geometrically, literally speaking. His longest experience in the sea never had brought such an impressive discovery, and he found this out 5 months ago when he was looking for new spots for fishing. So this has always been a mystery between South Africa and the Spanish Canary Islands and the Azores. So yeah, by the precision of the lines, this sailor really has the belief that this has an ancient origin. And yeah, since decades that people are searching where this stuff were. And I don't know how to say this really, but there was always expeditions from South Spain in looking of these islands. But yeah, in resume what this is telling, he's just telling the stories of the searches over the years and how nobody ever said anything else. Like a lot of rumors on the internet, which everybody knows, like the story in BBC years ago, and other stuff, you know, because there's been quite some interesting facts.
My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an author and anthropologist, and would like to invite you to join me in awakening from a long amnesia. Species with Amnesia, Our Forgotten History. Gods with Amnesia, Subterranean Worlds of Inner Earth. The Occult Secrets of Vril. And 1666, Redemption Through Sin. I would like to thank my subscribers who share my posts, as I rely on word of mouth, and I appreciate all of the positive feedback, reviews on my books, and I thank you very much for listening. Measuring over 1,000 miles from southwest to northeast and 500 miles from north to south, the Gobi is a vast desert in Asia, spanning from northern China to southern Mongolia. once part of the great Mongol Empire and located prominently along the famous Silk Road, the Gobi Desert has an even more ancient and mysterious occult history of subterranean worlds, which is now resurfacing. Having several Chinese names, including Shamo, a generic term for desert, and Hanhai, which means endless sea, the most popular name given to the legendary empire that was once said to have existed here in ancient times is Mu. Following major cataclysms which left the desert in its current condition, the inhabitants of Mu were said to have taken refuge in underground cities which they had terraformed inside of gigantic natural caves and caverns. Beneath southern China's landscape, researchers have discovered some of the largest underground chambers in the world. One huge cage system in Chongqing province is so large that it has clouds, fog, streams, vegetation, and even its own weather system. In 1992, 24 man-made caves were discovered in China, displaying incredible craftsmanship that involved the excavation of 36,000 cubic meters of stone. The floor of the grotto was more than 2,000 square meters, with the tallest point exceeding 30 meters. There are no historical references to these caves, and the reason they were built is still uncertain. Reed Flute Cave is located in southern China. According to legend, it got its name because the reeds by the cave's mouth could be made into flutes. The limestone cave offers a majestic fairyland of stalactites, stalagmites, stone pillars, stone curtains, birds, plants, and animals in fantastic shapes and colors. Inside, there are more than 70 inscriptions in ink, which date as far back as 792 AD to the Tang Dynasty. And these aged inscriptions tell us that it's been an attraction in China since ancient times. The cave is about 240 meters long, and the guided tour currently lasts about an hour. The interior of the cave is a spectacular gallery of gorgeous geological formations created by thousands of years of water erosion on the soft limestone. The walls also consist of beautifully rippling, eroded patterns which have dripped into the rock over the millennia. Today, countless multicolored lights dramatically illuminate the Reed Flute Cave. The lights are hidden in the cracks and crevices, and the effect is almost surreal as the lights turn the otherwise dark space into a strange mix of bright neon colors and rough natural shades. Many people are unaware of the fact that China has massive pyramids that are much larger than the Nubian pyramids and even those found in Mesoamerica. In fact, the size of the pyramids found in China may even be larger than the Sun Pyramid at Teotihuacan in Mexico, as well as the Cheops Pyramid in Egypt. Until recently, officials have rebuffed all questions about these pyramids and all requests to view them. Farmers were encouraged by the communist government to plant trees on them, probably in an effort to disguise them, make them harder to see. As photos started emerging and technology such as Google Maps made it clear that these Chinese landscapes were littered with pyramids, which incidentally are aligned exactly the same way as those in Egypt and in other places. When the authorities finally did acknowledge the existence of such structures, they would not characterize them as pyramids. Rather, they claimed that these very ancient structures were trapezoidal burial tombs dated from the Han Dynasty. But it now seems that breakthroughs in genetics and archaeological finds are providing new insights into these and other ancient discoveries. The official story is that New Zealand was uninhabited until 800 years ago. The oral tradition, however, of the Maori tribes, the indigenous Polynesians that live in New Zealand, tell of legendary blonde fairy people living in hobbit-like burrows and red-haired giants that also roamed these islands in ancient times. So, who were these blonde and red-headed populations that are described in these myths, and what happened to them? The well-known Kiwi legend speaks of a time when the first canoes arrived, only to find that there was already a race of blonde-haired fairies that lived in the forest, and they were called the Patu Pailare. Now, the Maori respected these little people who were very elusive, rarely seen, but they could hear them giggling and chuckling at night and rowing their small wakas, which are basically like canoes, and their skin color was described as light or pale, their hair was light, and they were sometimes seen on the slopes of the Misty Mountains. And they would come down to the sea to fish, and this would usually take place in the evening at night when it was dark or very misty. And as the legend says, one early morning, one of the Maori were said to have witnessed blonde people fishing, and I presume they were startled and they took off, but they left behind one of their nets, which from then on was used by the Maori themselves, who attribute this method of fishing technology to these little fairies. They also learned from them how to make a type of musical instrument, a flute that they carved, and they were considered to be, sort of magical people, and upon occasion they would play their flute and lure away, enchant a woman, and she would never be seen from again. There's another legendary race of fair-skinned people from New Zealand with golden hair, and they were agriculturalists. They carved out amphitheaters, and these people were said to be tall, had very white skin, and were likely the origin of the famous tattoos that you see.
Fully facial tattoo, which was only for the ones of high rank. People think everyone got tattoos in the old days. They're wrong. 5 to 10% at the most. You had to be something to deserve it, especially a facial tattoo. The people that were basically here before we got here, okay? Well known to be, tall, fair-skinned, definitely not little fairies. They are still around. They're all still blonde. Were these people real or not? They were. We've got a family, who descend from them.
There are modern blonde populations in New Zealand called the Waka Blondes, and they're Maori, but they have a distinct, different lineage than the Polynesian people.
We've got people in New Zealand who were once described as the Waka Blondes. A lot of them actually have very traceable whakapapa. That's much, much older than any of the Polynesian Maori whakapapa. And they know where they came from. I know one individual, an old kuia, a very dignified lady, who claims to come out of Persia. And the area that she's talking about, very close to India. And when we did DNA analysis on this lady, it shows a high incidence of her blood group or her DNA in the Persian area, so she's quite correct. But then the second big block, if you like, of people that share her DNA are found in Peru.
This is very interesting, as it concurs almost exactly with a Maori legend recorded over 100 years ago by ethnologist Elsden Best when he was living amongst the Tuhoi people. The legend tells us that their ancestors in times long passed away, 165 generations or around 3,500 years ago, migrated from a hot country named India. The cause of this exodus was a disastrous war with the dark-skinned folk in which great numbers were slain. This war was recorded in the Indian epic known as the Mahabharata. The legend continues on to describe their voyages which eventually took them into Polynesia. They crossed the oceans to Tawhiti-Roa, a long, skinny land believed to be Central America, and then on to Tawhiti Nui, a very large land, South America. And from there they ventured into the scattered isles of the Pacific. This Tuhoi story describes a very different history to the one that asserts that the Polynesians came from Taiwan, and it could even turn Pacific prehistory on its head.
We came from this ancient place outside of Egypt named ancient Persia. Today it is named Iran or Iran, whichever way you want to say it. But when I told my family, they were proud when I told them that they came from ancient Persia. Some of them said, "Oh, are we Arabs?" I said, "Well, actually, we'd be described as being Egyptian more than Arabs."
We couldn't believe our eyes when we first saw Monica's family. Right in front of us was a living representation of the green-eyed, golden-haired people we've been looking for. They're not just fairy folk of the forest or mythical beings. They are real.
This ancient Iranian or Aryan bloodline, incidentally, is the same that we find in the oldest mummies found in China, which, like most of the mummies in ancient Egypt, are blonde and red-headed and have Caucasoid features.
The mummies from China don't look like they should be in China. They look like they should be in Denmark or Ireland or northern Germany, because they look like people from over there. DNA steps up to the plate, and they can tell us where they came from. Well before the opening of the Silk Road, which is dated to 138 BC, these mummies date back, some of them, to 2000 BC. The female mummies were mostly of local origin. However, there's another type of testing, the Y chromosome testing, which is the male line. The males came from parts further west, not necessarily Ireland, but places like Iran, maybe towards parts of Turkey. The mom's side and the grandmother's side is from the Tarim Basin, and the father's and the grandfather's side were moving in with their sheep, with their herds, slowly but surely, and having families.
Geneticists have compared mitochondrial DNA from blue-eyed individuals in countries as diverse as Jordan, Denmark, and Turkey, concluding that people with blue eyes have a single common ancestor that lived by the Black Sea around 8,000 years ago and spread out with agriculture. Professor Eiberg from the Department of Cellular and Molecular Medicine at the University of Copenhagen said, and I quote, "The first blue-eyed humans were among the Proto-Indo-Europeans who subsequently spread agriculture into Western Europe and later rode horses into Iran and India. It's called Filefot in England, Hakenkreuz in Germany, Tetragrammaton in Greece, Wan in China, Manji in Japan, and Swastika in India." In his 1896 book, The Swastika, the earliest known symbol and its migrations, Thomas Wilson former curator of the Department of Prehistoric Anthropology in the U.S. National Museum, wrote of the swastika, and I quote, "an Aryan symbol used by the Aryan peoples before their dispersion throughout Asia and Europe. This might even serve as an explanation how, as a sacred symbol, the swastika might have been carried to different peoples, in which we now find it by the splitting up of Aryan peoples and their migrations and establishment in various parts of Europe." There are populations in modern Iran, such as the Kurds, specifically the Yazidi, who, unlike their Arab and Islamic oppressors, are Indo-European people, and Adnan Kokar, chairman of the Kurdish Cultural Center in London, said that, and I quote, "the Kurds and Yazidis are originally Aryans, but because the Yazidis are such a closed community, they have retained their fair complexion, blonde hair, and blue eyes. ISIS has taken around 300 women from Zinjar to give to jihadists to marry and make pregnant. If they can't kill all Yazidis, they will try to smash their blonde bloodline." Here is a video where mercenary militants explain their agenda, which includes ethnic genocide and interracial sex slavery, specifically mentioning genetic features targeted, such as blue eyes.
يا ولد زيديتي وين؟ اللي يريد يبيع. انا حطيت زيديتي ورقه انا اليوم صبايا اللي يريد يبيعها واللي يريد يديها واللي يريد كيف كل حر ياخذ نصيبه هو حر. كل من ياخذ نصيبه. صحيح؟ اخوي انا تختلف اذا عندنا زرق يختلف. اخوي ابيعك بفلوس. حسب كانت عمرها اخوي لازم نشوفها انت لازم نقلبها نقوي يعني نقوي سنون اخذ شلعه شيء اخوي يعني هذا شلعه السنون ما لها سنون شرد فيها حط لها طخه.
Many people are unaware that in the 1930s, the German government under Hitler sent archaeological expeditions to Asia in search of ancestral links between blonde Germans and ancient Buddhist and other Proto-Indo-Europeans, which the Nazis believed were connected to them linguistically, culturally, and indeed genetically. Today, academia and the media laugh at this, but academia and the media are still controlled by the same winners of World War II. The Buddhas of Bamiyan are massive monumental statues erected millennia ago along the Silk Road in the Bamiyan Valley, which runs through the Hindu Kush mountain region in Afghanistan. These caves were inhabited by monks, which not only left mummies but also ancient depictions of themselves.
Now, when the Muslims came along, many of the caves were destroyed. In fact, the caves were used as residences, and the tar from the fire covered many of the paintings inside, and that sort of saved those paintings. They've been able to remove the tar deposits from the fires of the last few centuries, and they have found Buddhist paintings, some of them of great beauty and color, inside the caves. A tremendous Buddhist religious complex. The large Buddha is 175 feet high, probably the biggest in all of the world, and here's what remains of it. The face was cut away many centuries ago when the Muslims took over this area, but there are Huddle and David at the bottom there to give you an idea of size, and you're looking up 175 feet. And above its head, above the head of this statue, we could see very unusual paintings. We were told it might be possible to go up there and see the paintings at close range.
We see the red beard and red hair. It's a shame that these figures have all been defaced by people of other faiths at some time in the past. But it's still, it's very easy to see what they looked like, and we can tell who they were. He's got the red beard, red hair parted in the middle.
The statues that you've seen, the caves themselves, are 1,500 or more years old. One last look at that magnificent big Buddha, 175 feet high, carved in these cliffs 1,500 years ago.
Nestled in the mountains between France and Spain, there is a semi-isolated population of native European people that have long puzzled anthropologists, linguists, and historians because although they are Caucasoid, they do not fit in with the rest of the European populations. Their language, for example, is distinctly unique in Europe and not related to any other Indo-European language. But that's not the only thing that's unique about the Basque. The Basque turned out to also be unique in terms of blood. Prior to the advent of genetic research tools, investigators used the ABO blood groups to study the relationships between human populations as well as their migration patterns. Each person's blood is one of four major types: A, B, AB, or O. Blood types are determined by the types of antigens on the blood cells. Antigens are proteins on the surface of blood cells that can cause a response from the immune system. The Rh factor is a type of protein on the surface of red blood cells. Most people are Rh positive. Those who do not have the Rh factor are Rh negative, which compromises about 15% of the world's population, but appears in much higher percentage among the Basque, which as a population contain among the highest levels of Rh negative blood in the world. The Basque people currently inhabit the area surrounding the Pyrenees Mountains, where Cro-Magnon man left behind some of his and her most famous artwork over 30,000 years ago. But exactly who are the Basque and where did they come from? I decided that a great place to find out is the University of Nevada, since it houses the Center for Basque Studies. This organization is primarily a research center that conducts and publishes on Basque-related topics such as anthropology, history, cultural studies, etc. Here's what they had to say about the Basque people and their origins, and this comes from their website's frequently asked questions. Question: where did the Basque come from? No one knows exactly where the Basque come from. Some say they have lived in the area since Cro-Magnon man first roamed Europe. Some say they are descended from the original Iberians. More fanciful theories exist as well. One is that the Basques are the descendants of the survivors of Atlantis. Question: where did the Basque language come from? Just as no one is sure about the origins of the Basques themselves, linguists are not in agreement over the origins of Euskara, the Basque language, either. When asked, I found that the majority of the Basque people themselves maintain that they came from Atlantica, a powerful maritime nation that sank into the Atlantic Ocean after a terrible cataclysm, and from which a few survivors reached the Bay of Biscay and the Pyrenees Mountains. This, they say, is not just mythology, but their true pre-European ancestry. There's another ancient people who claim racial lineage from the mythical Atlanteans. The Berbers are currently located geographically around Mount Atlas, but inhabit much of North Africa long before the Arabs arrived. The Berbers are considered the aboriginals of the area, and their origins beyond that are not officially known. Here we have a population many of whom have blue eyes and light hair, living in northwest Africa of all places. And amongst some of the blonde tribes still living near the Atlas Mountains of Morocco, the percentage of Rh negative blood can reach 40%. Now keep in mind, that's not the general national average, but restricted to certain local tribes. Anthropologists, for the most part, dismissed them for many years because they didn't fit well with the out of Africa paradigm. So it was presumed that they had migrated from somewhere in Europe. However, that theory has been abandoned with the current understanding of genetics. Scientists now accept the genetic evidence that concludes Berbers are an indigenous people, which they believe are descended from native Upper Paleolithic Cro-Magnon types, going straight back into the Pleistocene or Ice Age. This should make it easier to understand why the oldest remains found in Egypt, nicknamed Ginger, and currently on display in the British Museum, has naturally red hair. This is pre-dynastic, which means before the pharaohs and before the accepted dating of the pyramids. I can go on for quite some time about blonde and red-headed mummies and blue-eyed statues, but I'll save that for a future video on ancient Egypt. For now, let us turn to another population native to an island off of the African coast who also left mummies and pyramids. The Guanches were very tall, powerfully built, blonde and red-haired indigenous natives of the Canary Islands, specifically the island of Tenerife. To date, there is still no evidence that the Guanches had any knowledge of maritime technology, which begs the question, how did they get there? This isolation allowed the Guanche to maintain a racial exclusivity until the time of the Spanish conquest. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, 11th edition, concerning the ethnic origins and racial identity of the Canary Island Guanches, and I quote, "The Guanches are thought to have been of Cro-Magnon origin, with blue or gray eyes and blondish hair." Madame Blavatsky, foundress of the Theosophical Society, points out that the genetic relations between these three populations, well over 100 years before our modern understanding of DNA, and I quote, she says, "If then the Basque and Cro-Magnon cavemen are of the same race as the Canaries Guanches, it follows that the former are also allied to the Aborigines of America. The Atlantean affinities of the three types becomes patent." My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an author and anthropologist and would like to invite you to join me in awakening from a long amnesia. Species with Amnesia, Our Forgotten History. Gods with Amnesia, Subterranean Worlds of Inner Earth. The Occult Secrets of Vril. And 1666, Redemption Through Sin. I would like to thank my subscribers who share my posts, as I rely on word of mouth, and I appreciate all of the positive feedback, reviews on my books, and I thank you very much for listening.